I don't really have prepared opening remarks, but this is a subject that's really close to my heart because, I've been looking at issues of net neutrality since, I think, 2011. At that point in time, from what I remember, MTS had started data packs where certain apps were available for free in terms of data charges on the MTS network. And I thought this was a net neutrality issue. And then I remember someone on Twitter in like 2010-11 correcting me, saying that this is about pricing and pricing is not a net neutrality issue. And so when this argument came up later, my thinking was, in a country like India where data speeds are so slow, at that time we used to get some 256 kbps, broadband was 512 kbps or less, I think. As in a country like ours, it doesn't matter whether speeds, like whether something gets slowed down from 256 kbps or not. What matters is price. Because at that point in time, we were paying some $300 per GB. And now we're paying $13 per GB, right? So there's been a change in the market situation as we see it. But the other thing is this a new discussion? Has the market changed? And when I think about what is the need for doing this discussion? Why is the TRAI doing a consultation paper on net neutrality and banning of apps? And banning of apps is something that is clearly a new topic for us to consider. Because if you think about it, right, one of my challenges is, if you look at it from an argument perspective, banning the internet is a disproportionate act of censorship because you censor a lot of free speech alongside it. Banning a category of apps is lesser in terms of an impact, so better in terms of proportionality. Banning of just one app is even less proportionality. Does it make it better? Is everyone going to be happier if only one app is banned instead of the entire internet being shut down? Perhaps. But what purpose does it serve? So I think when we look at the way this environment is shaping up, when you look at, let's say, 2 weeks ago, there was a committee, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, and with a report on cybersecurity suggested that there needs to be a central negative registry for banning of lending apps that are not effectively legal or that are fake lending apps, etc. And that direction has to go to app stores to ban these apps. Now, app stores can ban one app, it can morph and come up in another one. How long will you keep doing this? These are all conversations that we need to have. How app stores are effective in doing this. Why should app stores be the one to do this? But the fact is, if a central negative registry is created, what impact does that have on the internet? Because, regulators got to regulate. There is, in tech policy, an idea called organizational intent and organizational design. When you have a body with a particular purpose, it has to do that job. TRAI has to come out with consultations. They probably have KPIs in terms of how many consultations they do in a year, right? And so therefore, the moment you create a body, that body has to justify the expenditure made on that. The moment you create a negative registry, will the scope of the registry expand from just lending apps to something else? So banning of individual apps is an important conversation for us to have. The other one is about network usage fees, and there are two angles to this. One is it's a conversation that happened here in this city on August 8, 2014, where the TRAI held just like an exploratory discussion at the PSC Chambers of Commerce, asking about what sort of an arrangement should be created between OTT services, and I don't like that phrase, they are the internet. So between online services and telecom operators. And I remember that place was full of telecom operators and barely anyone from an internet organization, or I think there were a couple of people from CIS, the Internet Freedom Foundation didn't exist at that point in time, and we were all discussing about why, like, I think I was probably the only one who took a mic and pushed back at that point in time, saying that this will have an impact on net neutrality. Uh, Raman Chima was on stage at that time. I think he was still at Google, and he also made the same point. But the TRA at that time was trying to create that revenue sharing agreement. It's been, what, almost 10 years? Well, actually 9 years. We're back to the same debate. So what has changed there? And if there is a requirement for online apps to contribute to network infrastructure, why? And then why messaging apps? And how will that system work? Who will get covered, who will not get covered? What's the framework going to be? Is it even needed? We know that, for example, there are operators that are struggling. Vodafone Idea is amongst one of them. Should it be the responsibility of an online app to basically make a telecom operator solvent? And shouldn't that come from a regulatory framework? So these are all questions for us to consider. And then at the core of it is this idea of licensing. Because the moment there is a slicing up of the internet into different types of apps, and there's a licensing framework for anything on the web, let's say for communications apps, who says that the licensing framework won't expand? And it's difficult to argue why there can't be licensing, right? Because what's so special about a communications app? Today, payment gateways are licensed. They're intermediaries. They were never licensed earlier. Today, the IT rules have a separate category for significant social media intermediaries, and they are under regulation. Media organizations, digital media organizations, online streaming service providers all have to register with the government. So why can't, what's so special about communications app that they shouldn't have a registration framework? So therefore, some of these discussions are new because the environment has changed. And so what I hope for this discussion here, for this room here to discuss, is what's right, what's wrong, why is it right, why is it wrong, what's going to happen next, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. Look at points, counterpoints. I want everyone to go out of this room with something new that you've learned from this conversation, something that that will make you think a little more deeply about it. And the way we do these discussions is that it takes every one of us in this room to contribute to this conversation, for all of us to learn from it. I learn from every conversation that I have in these rooms. And so there are no stupid comments. There are no stupid questions. Because sometimes it's the comment that will spark someone else's comment, or a question that will lead to an answer which someone hadn't considered. So the panels that we'll have will be, for us, they're a mechanism to a conversation in the room. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for coming to contribute to this conversation that all of us are going to have. Once the panel has finished, so to speak, I'll walk around with a mic and anyone can ask a question, anyone can give a comment. Let's treat this as a learning experience more than anything else. And ideally, I hope everyone's going to participate in the TRAI consultation process in the hope that when the telecom bill comes out, some of that makes its way to thinking about how it should be and how the internet ought to be regulated. Because there's another key question that is unsaid right now. Is there a part of the internet that's going to be regulated by the telecom ministry, the Department of Telecom, as opposed to the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology? And at the end of it, what is the impact that all of this is going to have on our access to the internet, on entrepreneurship, on our ability to create? Because the beauty of the internet, and this is something that also found its way in the differential pricing ruling from the TRAI, and this text was there, that essentially on the internet we're all users, we all create and not just consume. Today I can create an app without having a business. I can create a blog and run ads on it and make money on it. We're all not just consumers, we're creators. So the traditional thinking of businesses and consumers doesn't apply to the internet because it treats all of us as equal. And I remember writing a piece for The Hindu during the net neutrality debate about television versus the internet. And the internet allows you to have a billion channels. You can't do that on TV, right? So what is at stake here is also our ability to create. So I know I'm not going to take too much of time. I've already taken quite a bit. I'll hand it over to Aditi for the discussion on banning. Then we'll come in for a discussion on network fees, and we'll close it out with the discussion on licensing. Aditi? Thanks, everyone. Oh, yes, I do want to thank our sponsors. As a matter of disclosure, we've been sponsored by Meta and Google. And I'd like to thank the Center for Communications Governance, the Internet Freedom Foundation, CIS India for supporting this discussion. Aditi? And CCAOI.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aditi. Is it? Okay. Yeah. My name is Aditi Agrawal. I'm going to be moderating this session on understanding the issues with selective banning of apps. I'd like to invite the panelists now. We have Maknoon Wani, Jhalak Kakkad, and Samar Bansal. So just a bit of context setting, what this panel is going to be about and how it will play out. We have about an hour and a half, so I'm hoping to spend 50 minutes talking to the panelists and then 40 minutes for an open house discussion.
Hour and 15 minutes.
Sorry?
Hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, that's on me. 40 minutes with panelists and 45 minutes then with an open house discussion. So this panel will focus on why are we thinking about selective banning of apps? What does it compare to, which is internet shutdowns? How does it measure up against the principles laid down in the Anuradha Bhasin judgment? And what is the need for it, given that we have the telecom suspension rules, as well as Section 69A of the IT Act? So without further ado, let's just start. Jhalak, I'd like to begin with you, if that's okay. Why is TRAI venturing into this category? Because this seems like an overfull space right now where you have TRAI trying to mark its territory. You have the DOT through the telecom bill trying to regulate apps, create a licensing regime. You have the IT ministry already doing that through Section 69A. You already have the DOT through telecom suspension rules. And you will now also have central government and the data protection board involved through clause 37 of yesterday's bill. So
yeah, I mean, it's $1 million question, why we're seeing blocking coming in from everywhere and anywhere. But I think we all know the answer of that.
Can we state the obvious, please, for the record?
I think it's interesting how, I was talking to a colleague about this, and it's interesting how Shreya Singhal, though, it's been completely sort of, in many ways, sort of chipped away at in many ways, still seems to worry, policymakers as they try to formulate various mechanisms. And I think all of these mechanisms are being put in place in case one of the mechanisms falls. But I think what's interesting to me is the reference that was given to the TRAI was sort of pegged to the parliamentary committee report of the Standing Committee on Information Technology that specifically has made this reference to the DOT, asking them to examine the feasibility of selective app banning to deal with public order situations in lieu of a blanket internet shutdown, right? And I think if you go back and look at the committee report, which came out in December 2021, their sort of view was that this would be a better alternative, perhaps a more proportionate alternative to the blanket internet shutdowns that we are seeing in the country. If people are interested in this issue, I'd urge you to go read the Standing Committee report. I'd urge you to go read the action taken report of the Standing Committee, which records the DOT's responses and then the Standing Committee's observations to the DOT's responses. And I think there's a palpable sense of frustration within the committee in terms of how non-responsive many of the answers from the DOT were. I think it's just, I think all of this is being channeled in the context of the telecom bill, and it's probably an indication of what we're going to see in the telecom bill and the Digital India Act to come. And yeah, I think that's really where we are. We're seeing this notion of blocking and whitelisting coming in everywhere, and I think it's a trend that's here to stay.
So you brought up an interesting point from the Parliamentary Standing Committee report, which is that the committee got fed up of DOT for not establishing a causality between internet shutdowns and impact on public order, whether that's actually achieved. So are there any circumstances in which an internet shutdown is justifiable? Samar, I'd address this question to you, or if this falls along a spectrum.
Thank you, Aditi. You see, I think it's very difficult to answer such questions in a vacuum. I am personally speaking by nature not given to taking absolutist positions on either side. I don't think in a vacuum it's fair or reasonable on my part to say that there can never be a scenario where a government looking to whatever be a situation should never be allowed to carry out a ban. We are talking in the context of selective bans, of course. Or for that matter, that there should be a scenario where there is a carte blanche given to them, that regardless of reason, motivation or justification, they should be given the permission. And I honestly speak as a lawyer, I probably am the least literate person tech-wise in this room of very, very learned people. But speaking from the perspective of a lawyer, I would say that the test has to always flow from the lodestone, which is the Constitution. And what we begin with is that our Constitution is a constitution of rights, not a constitution of restrictions. And therefore, the first thing you begin with is, while we always talk of 19.1 giving us all of our fundamental rights, and we talk of 19.2 giving restrictions, the point is, I feel somewhere or the other, the makers of the Constitution meant something by putting 1 first and 2 second. Therefore, what's important is that there is a fundamental right now in Anuradha Bhasin, which has been held, that to conduct business and commerce and discussions over the internet is a fundamental right. Banning selectively or otherwise is obviously a restriction thereon. If I look at it purely from a constitutional lens, per se, is banning always bad? No, that cannot be, because 19.2 says a reasonable restriction is permissible, constitutionally speaking. The million-dollar question, of course, therefore becomes what is reasonable and what is not. Now, here there is a gulf between theory and practice, perhaps what you alluded to as well. The theory, of course, is that in Anuradha Bhasin and others, we have laid down tests of proportionality, tests of least intrusive method, so that even if you are to impose a restriction, it should be the least intrusive way of doing that particular thing. Now, all of these are very well, but unfortunately, what we have seen is that in practice, policymakers perhaps themselves are grappling with the difficulties of responding to emergent scenarios. And courts, when faced with judicial challenges, are doing their best, or perhaps you may say they're not, but they are perhaps not always meeting the issue head-on. What they should be doing, in my view, is really a very cold-blooded forensic application of the Constitution and an application of the tests as laid down in Anuradha Bhasin and other judgments, which is to see whether the particular ban is the least intrusive way of doing it. Is it even an effective way of doing it? Suppose you ban, what was the objective? As we know, the orders must have reasons, the orders must speak. Therefore, there must be a close scrutiny, as I always believe. The amount and the strictness of judicial review and the strictness of scrutiny of a governmental action must be directly proportionate to the impact it has on the citizen. Therefore, the higher the impact on the citizen, the graver and deeper and stricter the level of judicial review. By that, once again, I'm stressing, I am not stating the government cannot do it, but I'm stating that when the government does it, if the ban affects one app versus 100 apps, if a ban affects an app that is perhaps an SSMI or affecting a larger group of people versus a smaller group of people, if it is in a geographical area that is larger versus smaller, if it is for a temporal duration that is longer rather than smaller, all of these are factors that the courts must grapple with. Challenges have happened. We've seen in the recent context of the unfortunate situation in Manipur. I would say the court has partially responded there with an order, as we all know, of restoring fixed line services, certain direct-to-home services, etc. But of course, that does not serve the larger whether that is a complete solution or not is something that can be debated. At the same time, what I feel bad is that whether Anuradha Bhasin or the Manipur cases, there is no direct engagement with the banning orders on constitutional touchstones. Ultimately, the courts adopt a somewhat panchayati approach. And I understand that courts do that sometimes. I face that as well. But perhaps the constitutional mandate was to meet the issue head on. And that perhaps has not been done.
You bring up some interesting points about how the effectiveness of any ban, whether it be absolute or it be selective, has to be gauged. And part of that is on the basis of perhaps the number of users, its effectiveness, its reach. So it may have fewer users, but maybe it's used across India. It could be whether it's infrastructural. Maknoon, I want to come to you there. You had mentioned during one of the conversations with the team that certain apps are almost infrastructural. For instance, if I were to ban WhatsApp today, not in India, let's say, even in Delhi, or Delhi is too big a place, let's say a sparsely populated area, it would still have an impact, a worse impact than, say, banning a 3Ma. Because WhatsApp has almost become infrastructural where it's used for payment services by MSMEs, it's used for basic communication, it's used for news. So is there perhaps a hierarchy of apps, and is it worse to ban one app over another? And we'll come to subsequent problems with that once you've answered. Was there an earthquake? Oh, sorry.
It's just a question you asked.
Yeah. This discussion is earth-shattering. But yeah, please.
Thank you, Aditi. I think this is a good question. So when we talk about, so let's look at the TRAI consultation paper, what it says. It talks about the back reference where, as she mentioned, that the parliamentary standing committee is looking for alternatives to internet shutdowns, selective bans on apps. And it talks about why these selective bans might mitigate, obstructions to services such as financial services, education, healthcare. But when you look at the apps that they have mentioned, Telegram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, I'd say all these three apps are fundamentally integrated with all these services. Let's take the example of WhatsApp. WhatsApp is used by doctors to consult with specialists. It's used by students in their classroom groups, right? Then let's talk about Telegram. If there are any UPSC aspirants here, you'll know that all of the content for UPSC aspirants comes on Telegram, right? And Facebook is used to advertise. It's used to generate leads, right? My family has a small business. We use WhatsApp. We use Facebook to send samples, photos of samples. So these apps, all of these three apps, or apps which give related services, they are used by for all these services. So if you talk about objectives, these apps constitute more than, let's say, more than half of the total internet value chain. So if you ban these apps, you're effectively banning a significant portion of the internet. So I don't know how these objectives will be met, how this alternative is better than the internet shutdown itself. So just a quick point that I want to add. I think when we talk about bans, whether banning of apps or whether banning of internet shutdowns, we can talk about proportionality. But when we talk about mitigation strategies, we should think about content moderation. That is the only effective solution that we can look at. I know there are problems there, but content moderation is something that can have very targeted, that is a very targeted approach. And we can just mitigate, like if you're talking about extremist groups fomenting trouble, misinformation, disinformation, then we should just focus on content moderation.
Two follow-up questions there. Yeah. Who's going to do the moderating, right. One, and B, what happens to my favorite kind of apps, that's end-to-end encrypted apps?
Who's going to moderate the apps?
The content on the apps. Is it going to be in-house, or do we stick to the IT rules, due diligence guidelines under Rule 3?
I think it has to be in-house. I think we'll have to let the platforms regulate. Of course, there has to be an independent committee. There has to be something like UK's
Section
Ofcom.
69, eh?
No.
Okay.
There's no independent judicial authority that scrutinizes their authority, that scrutinizes their orders. What I mean to say is that we need an authority that is relatively autonomous. Those structures are not here in India. We can look at Ofcom that regulates such content or is going to regulate such content in the UK. We can look at similar structures that are autonomous, semi-autonomous, and which have clear policy regulated guidelines, which they can publish, and then they can have some sort of regulation on those platforms. But primarily, I think platforms have to have that authority over the content that they are supposed to regulate.
You used a very interesting phrase, apart from not answering the question about end-to-end encrypted apps, which was that platforms should have authority over the content that they host. Chalak, do you want to come in here vis-a-vis Shreya Singhal?
Where are you leading me, Aditi?
I'm not leading you anywhere. I just thought that the phrase was very interesting, that platforms should have authority. Not control, but authority. Perhaps anonymous, perhaps not, over the content they have. So should they be held liable?
I mean, I think Safe Harbor has been sort of fundamental in enabling the growth and innovation over the internet that we have seen, right? It has been transformational in allowing, and Nikhil alluded to this earlier, the rise of millions of creators in our own country, forget globally. And all of that starts to fall apart, and bringing voices of marginalized and vulnerable to the fore, all of that starts to fall apart if we start to tinker with this structural system of safe harbor that we have, right? Because the moment platforms feel that they're going to be held liable for content, their inclination is going to be to over-remove content, to over-censor content. And then, we lose a lot of the value of these platforms and the internet that we have. Now, are there problems on platforms? 100%. Do we need to find ways to tackle them? 200%, right? But is this the way to tackle it? I'm not so sure. I think we need to talk about, and some of these are going to sound very high level and idealistic, but we need to talk about transparency provisions. We need to talk about researcher access to platforms to understand the nature of information flows, the way that whole ecosystem is working. We need to talk about platform audits to start to understand the scale and nature of the exact problem that we are facing, rather than going to the other extreme and saying that we're completely going to remove safe harbor for platforms in this scenario.
Got it. Probably Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar will disagree with you because he wants to remove safe harbor for certain platforms. I'm sorry, I forget to speak into the mic. Sabha, I'll come to you, just building up on something that Makhnoon said, which is that a few of these apps or these online services occupy most of the traffic online. So which allows for a certain amount of centralization on the internet. Matthew Green had tweeted a couple of days ago that when it comes to the internet, it's easy to say that it's ungovernable because it's so vast and you have these little pockets that nobody can see. But most of the people are using, say, 5 to 6 apps or 5 to 6 websites every day. And therefore, if you have control over them, you have control over the internet. Now, the question is, when there's so much centralization of the internet on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have a government that's seeking absolute control, centralization of power, what kind of negotiations could happen when you have the option of selective banning of apps? I'll give you an example. When it comes to banning, say, a Threema or a Briar, which is used by very few people in this country, it's okay. It won't even make front page headlines. On the other hand, if you were to ban WhatsApp, it will be there everywhere. The news will go viral on WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, all those things. And then WhatsApp also has certain leverage with the government. But on the other hand, the government also has certain leverage over WhatsApp because India is the biggest market for most of these apps. So would they be willing to negotiate with the Indian government and make massive concessions in a way that they perhaps would not do for a UK?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't speak for WhatsApp or any other large app provider, but I suppose experience has shown that, and of course unverified reports have shown that across the world, ultimately they're running a business. So across the world, I think there are conversations that happen, whether in back rooms or front rooms, that's a different issue, between governments and large app providers. And I wholly agree with my fellow panelists that certain apps have virtually attained the status of infrastructure today. And therefore, to that extent, perhaps the government would also be, honestly, I hadn't heard of half of the apps that were banned before this. I mean, as I said, they may have some very specific use cases, they may be open source based or whatever it is, but the common average user would not even know those. So definitely it's easier to go against them, and that would be as it would be in the tech or non-tech space. So to your question that would there be an element of negotiation, I think whatever we may discuss in theory, in reality there is going to be an element of negotiation. There is going to be perhaps not a proportionate action against the larger players as there would be against the smaller players. But once again, coming from a place of judging the possibility of selective banning, I would say that again, the first point to see is that possibly if at any point of time there was a ban, let's say, of a larger and more well-used communication, OTT communication app, I would say definitely in terms of the various proportionality and least intrusive principles as laid down by the court, that would be far harder for the court, for the government to justify. And as I said, we need to ultimately, what I don't understand is that now we are not talking in a vacuum. Ultimately, law and its implementation should be data-driven. It is not that apps have not been banned. It is not that we have not had whole-scale internet shutdowns in this country. We have had all of those. Now, without any preconceived notions as to whether things are right or wrong, we know the stated object that was sought to be achieved. Of course, sometimes the orders themselves are not publicized, so in a way, perhaps we don't know. But even on the very cursory language and sometimes boilerplate language that is used, we can discern what the purpose was. Why can't we do a forensic ex post facto analysis that, look, you wanted to, let's say, stop the spread of disinformation. You wanted to stop the spread of misinformation. You wanted to stop the flow of violence. Now, the spread of these things is certainly one factor. These are multi-dimensional, multi-factor things. But surely in that multi-factored approach and analysis that I'm sure the government would be doing, they would know that, look, all right, we had sought to achieve, let's say, a 10% difference, a 15% difference. Did you achieve that? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I really don't know. But a data-driven approach should be there versus a countervailing analysis that what were the deleterious effects of this ban on other people. You brought up, for example, your business or your family's business access, and I would rather say that's perhaps more long-term. Let's say in a time when, once again, the troubled state of Manipur that we're seeing, access to medical services, simply reporting commissions of crime to the police, perhaps countering disinformation with genuine information, not by official sources, but by citizens groups, right? Things like that. So it's a very complex issue. I don't think any of us should fall into the trap of in a knee-jerk or reflexive manner falling into this camp or that. Ultimately, it should be a data-driven analysis that what has been the actual performance of the app bans, because these discussions shouldn't be up in the air. So therefore, in these negotiations with these larger players, the actual impact would come into play. And at all times, you must remember, and as I always remember, I'm sorry, I won't take much more of your time, but there's a tendency, and like everyone else, governments have an inertia. I'm a science student, so there's an inertia of motion and there's an inertia of rest. Yeah. Governmental inertia is typically to continue doing what they have always done. And reflexively, and this is how it happens across the world. There will always be an attempt to adhere to as few of the processual checks and safeguards as possible. And that's where the courts step in and have stepped in to a certain extent. And we must always be guided by the principle, a very old English case that is always cited, all lawyers know it, of Liversidge versus Anderson, where a very famous English judge, Lord Atkin, said that even in the clash of arms, even during the clash of arms, the law is not silent. So therefore, of course, we're not talking about a situation of clash of arms, but if there's an internal disturbance or whatever, the fact is the law and due process continues to apply. And that must never be forgotten.
So I had a quick question, Samar. How do you prove a negative? how do you actually prove
Yeah.
that an internet shutdown
Yeah.
led to violence not happening or
Well,
led to the reduction in
Well,
violence?
possibly, as I said,
How
you're
do you
right.
prove a negative?
These are not mathematical equations. So you're absolutely correct. It's not going to be a 10 minus 8 is equal to 2. At the same time, you would say that something impelled you to issue the ban. There was a certain situation on the ground. Your analysis was that one of the major factors in fomenting the problems was the massive spread of disinformation. Now, your solution was that by issuing the ban, now the misinformation is going to be substantially stopped because now communication has become harder. 10 days, 15 days, 20 days into the ban, surely you have people on the ground, you have people collecting data, have the people who were spreading misinformation shifted to apps you didn't ban. You can check that at a network level, at the OTT level, etc. You can check what has been the amount of violence that were the districts that were struck by violence. Has that even gone down by a certain percentage? We may not have mathematically precise answers, but ultimately in any normative, value-driven judgment, there has to be some means of judging outcomes. And I think while we may not have a perfect answer, at the same time, if ultimately you find that there was no or negligible impact of your decision to ultimately impinge on someone's fundamental right, then that should certainly be a factor in your decision making and your own analysis of whether that was a sound approach to take or not.
Just coming to the definitions for a little bit, we've been talking about communication apps, but the TRI paper focuses on all apps. Sorry. We've been mainly focusing on communication apps or social media apps, but the TRI paper talks about all apps. And my question is, why are we only looking at apps, which also builds on your point? You ban an app, you can sideload it. You can use a VPN. You can use it on the browser. So why is the focus only on the app economy? Is it just because most of the internet users in this country access the internet through their phones? Any of you? Maknoon?
Just a quick point. Maybe they're not going to ban it just on the App Store. Because what happened in 2017 when 22 apps were banned in Kashmir, they asked the internet service providers to ban it. Maybe we can have this discussion later. Maybe that's why they're relying on app bans rather than 69A. That's one of the questions.
So that's
like
interesting because even under 69A,
Yeah.
orders can be issued to
Telecom.
the telecom service providers via the Department of Telecommunications.
Right.
So, because when you want a website banned, blocked is the correct word. When you want it blocked, you go via TSPs.
Yes.
So, if you can add.
Yeah,
more
I mean,
nuance.
that's it. That was the point. I just want to make this point that, they are banning these apps. Sorry.
No, that's fine. If you want to win.
I mean, just again, totally out of my wheelhouse entirely. But as I said, one of the things was also the technical aspect. So on this selective app banning, which is the topic of this discussion, the other thing is, and again, I am utterly unqualified to speak about this. All of you are far more qualified. But the other point I'd like to learn about here is the feasibility. You know, at the TSP level, at the actual OTT app provider level, what are the technical hitches that would be there? And what is the actual feasibility in terms of, as you said, workarounds of VPNs, workarounds of, for example, they permitted static IP-based internet. But that's really for a very few, that's on lease line services on for very few people. Most of us and users would be using on a dynamic IP-based thing. So really what would be even the feasibility, the law, because that's even for someone like me, on a proportionality test or on a least intrusive method test, the actual feasibility of the ban is something that definitely should factor in, though as I said, I'm not the one really qualified to speak about that.
So I can
We'll
shed.
go around the room to discuss technical stuff when we can.
I can just shed a little bit of light on it. Contrasting two different bans that happened. One was the Chinese app ban, which happened under 69A. The orders were issued to the gatekeeping intermediaries, which were the app stores in that case. And the other is the ban on the 14 messaging apps in Kashmir. Those orders were issued to TSPs and those were specific to Kashmir. And the way it worked was that, at least from what I understood after talking to a few TSPs, was that gateways, that's the term that they used, the telecom gateways were controlled. And unlike earlier, say 10 years in the past or 20 years in the past, when we had fewer gateways, so if you shut down a gateway, say, I think the example taken was Calcutta, then you would also shut down the services in Bihar. Whereas now, since you have more gateways, it's possible to have more localized blocking orders executed through TSPs. But we can discuss this during this session.
We can actually, I know who to go to for this.
Okay, so 3 things about this. Number 1, blocking of websites at a country level in India, whether an ISP has a license, let's say only for Meerut or for the whole state or for the whole country, is relatively easier. I'm not talking of the VPN and other type of options, I mean those apart. So that's very much feasible. Although even for that, instead of blocking it at the level of each and every ISP, by the way, there are more than 2,000 valid ISP licenses as on date, okay, from DOT. So it's too much of paperwork and too much of follow-up, etc. It's much easier, even if DOT wants to do this, to issue these directions only to the ISPs who have an international gateway, whether satellite or fiber, and that's just a handful. And if they just block it there, that works. Secondly, if there's anything which is within the country, obviously they have multiple means, both the ISP as well as the place wherever it is hosted, okay? So that's one point. Second thing is selective blocking. Selective blocking is extremely problematic. So for example, almost 20 years back, there was a case that in Hyderabad.
Can I break up the idea of selective
Sure.
blocking into 2 parts? Part number 1 is selective, so 3 parts. One is selective blocking of a single app across the country. Second is selective blocking of a single app in a single district. And the third is selective blocking of a category of apps in a district, because blocking in a country is international gateways, we know. What about the districts? Like single app, single district.
Yeah. So this third point.
Mike.
Yeah. Sorry. So this third point about selective blocking at a district level is extremely difficult, and it's going to be much more difficult. For example, just last week when we had the situation in Gurgaon, for example, in the same district, not the whole of Gurgaon, but it was said that okay, subdivision of Nu and some areas, that's where you need to block. So to do this type of blocking, it's not that it is impossible. I mean, you can block something, let's say, at each and every tower level for that matter, but then that's going to require a huge level of investment by the service providers and also much more management also from them in terms of technically doing it. So one is having the capability, technical capability and feasibility. Second is actually to manage it that way, that ki ek particular tower ko humko keval block karna hai. So it's going to be extremely difficult. There was a situation I was saying earlier about 20 years back that in Hyderabad, High Court had said that block this particular website. Now, their remit was only in Andhra Pradesh region at that time, the undivided Andhra Pradesh. And it was difficult for many of the large ISPs. So some of the regional ISPs, they could do it much easily compared to the larger ISPs because they had all India licenses and they were running on a single DNS. So if you are running multiple DNS, if you are running a DNS in every Gram Panchayat, every village, every mohalla, then fine, it's possible to do it.
So 2 parts. Can I just explore this a little bit? Before
Yeah,
we
I
jump
just
in?
had a follow-up question to that.
So did I. So one type of app ban can be directly from an app service provider, right? So let's say I'm
X.
I want to ban users in, let's say, Chhattisgarh from using Twitter or X. What is my feasibility of blocking in Chhattisgarh? Number 1. Number 2 is because effectively that becomes disproportionate, right? If you block everyone. Second is what is my feasibility or what is the feasibility of a telecom operator to block usage of a particular app in a particular district? Both.
So let me come to the second point first. So the
Second is easier.
Yeah. So for the telecom provider to block it at a circle level is much easier. Circle level, I'm saying, because that's the licensing area that they have, rather than at a district level. But even at district level, perhaps it might be possible.
The city of Jaipur has had, for example, the highest number of internet shutdowns in Rajasthan. It has.
Yeah.
So can, let's say, Twitter be blocked in Jaipur?
It might be possible. Again, I'm not so sure about that. But the first point, on the first point, it's almost impossible for Twitter to block it only in Jaipur or only in Delhi or like that, on the first question.
Okay, so the second is easier. So the
second might be. I'm not
Is
so
this
sure
why
about
this
that.
might be
On the
vested with
telecom
DOT
operator.
instead of
Yeah.
METI?
And also, because all the licensees, one, that they are known entities, okay? So you know who the licensee is, who the licensees are, so you can communicate to them. When it comes to the individual app developers, sometimes the government of India doesn't even know who the app developers are.
No, we're presuming a situation where all communications apps will be registered or licensed. But Aditi, you had a question.
Yeah, sir, I wanted to ask you, you said that because there are more than 2,000 registered ISPs in this country, so when an order is issued, when a blocking order is issued, does the order go to 2,000 ISPs or whoever is active
I don't
in
know
that
about
area?
now, because I used to work in an ISP till 17 years back. So till that time, the order used to physically go to each and every ISP. Only thing is, DOT officials would to call up and send it by fax those days at times, not on email. And we used to encourage them to send it by email at least, but they had limitations. So they used to send it by fax. And they used to say, at least follow up with all the large ISPs that go ahead and block it, okay? So if most of the larger ISPs had blocked it, it would have sufficed them to a certain extent. By the way, you should also look at a particular press release of DOT, which is I think 19 or 20 July 2006, okay? Which actually says that ISPs are hereby directed to block, I mean those days we didn't have apps that way, but it was about URLs, block specific URLs or web pages and not the whole domain, okay? So that's still a press release of that time, which
So
was
if
prior
I
to
can-
69A.
If I can summarize it, just 1 second, because I think this also leads us back to the speaker. Sorry, yeah, Amrita.
Thanks. We had a discussion last week, and one of the speakers, Parag Kaur, actually mentioned that selective banning is very difficult. One, responding to Nikhil's question, for example, an app needs to be kind of selectively banned in a particular area. The telecom provider has to have an always on access of, access to the device so that they can track it and switch it off. So I, as a user, have to give that access. And if someone is kind of getting into my system and accessing it without my consent, that is a concern, privacy concern. Second is that many times if, for example, a particular app or anything has to be blocked in a particular place, you would need to know the servers from which it is coming, and sending, sharing the IPs of servers, etc., is a concern, because normally they are masked because of various kinds of security attacks, etc., which can happen. So as per Parakor, selective banning is technically difficult to happen, and I think the technologists need to be there in the discussion, where when we talk about a lot of things, it's not so easy, because for example, they may want an app ban in Jaipur, but I may be traveling from Delhi. Will my activity also be banned? In that case, the telcos have to have access to my phone always. To kind of know where I am, what I am using, and that is scary.
Amrita, if I can ask you a follow-up question
So
on...
we got a third level now, Aditi, in the sense.
Huh?
Level 1 is blocking it at an application level.
Yeah.
Level 2 is banning it at a telecom operator level. Level 3, what she's talking about, Amrita is talking about, is banning
Device
it at
level.
a user device level on the basis of what their phone number is, which requires deep packet inspection. And when
So-
Reliance Jio was launched, Reuters did a story citing unnamed sources that Jio is doing deep packet inspection, but I don't know if it's true, so I don't want to
So
be held
that's
accountable
one-
for referencing it.
One part, what I had also heard from sources, I can say sources because I'm a journalist, was that when it comes to blocking selective apps, it's not on the basis of the end user, but on the basis of the IP addresses of the service. So for instance, if you want to block Facebook in Jaipur, what you would do is you have a list of Facebook servers' IP addresses.
You will not have it, because Facebook will never want to give
Those
it.
are publicly available because...
No. Server details are never publicly given, because it would cause vulnerability. You will get it, even some ransomware gang will get it. Why
Or
would they give
DDoS
your
attack.
IPs? As in, they would, server details are always masked. As in, it's like I'm saying my locker is in SBI and this is my number. You don't do that. IP addresses of servers, as in, that
You
They
can
are
actually Google them to
you
make
can
sure.
get the IP block, but where the server is actually located,
Yeah,
I don't
not-
think anyone will
not
give
the
those
server
IP
location,
numbers.
but the, I'm sorry, I used the wrong term, the IP block. So
All
yeah, the
servers
IP
will be
address.
located in India eventually.
Yeah, so when it comes to the IP addresses, you block any ping that goes to the IP address. So it's not at user level.
No, but if you look at it, Meta, for example, if they are taking some X number of blocks from Appnik, within that, they may use it for, say, Facebook, they may use it for WhatsApp, they may use it for any of their internal work. Now, if you block that entire thing, even their work will come to a standstill. You are targeting one particular app. Airtel, for example, has some X number of slashes from Appnik. Okay, now if you're trying to block everything is not used for customers or enterprise, right? They are also using it to run their service. How will you block the entire lot?
Got it. So Airtel's own employees, if I can use the word, in Jaipur could potentially get affected if you were to block Facebook servers. Or rather say Microsoft servers, and if they were using Azure.
See, for example, when you take a block of IP, you don't use that entire block for one particular thing. It is used even when, for example, when you were talking about Manipur and they were saying that everyone has to have a particular IP, when you or I am getting an IP from any of the telco, even at home, it is not a static IP.
It's dynamic.
Right, so they keep changing. Even within their services, they may rotate it. So how would you block it completely?
If I'm not wrong, Jio maintains a database of which dynamic IP addresses are allotted to which number.
No, that they will do, but we are talking about the servers which are
Got it.
disseminating information. Those are crucial things. They will not compromise that security by giving it to everyone.
And just building up on what Deepak sir said, just one
Huh.
sec, because I have a question for the speakers. Deepak sir mentioned something very interesting, that we have 2,000 ISPs. DOT will be happy if the top 3 comply. The remaining 1997, it's okay because they're too tiny. Now that also raises a question for apps. WhatsApp complies, but a tiny app, I don't know, black messaging box or whatever, does not. Then what happens? And what is the purpose? What Samar was also talking about, that if you have jumped onto another app, you're still untraceable, you're still communicating. So is the aim ever achieved with selective banning, or is a total internet shutdown the only option then? I'm playing the devil's advocate here by saying total internet shutdown might be the only option.
I mean, I think this comes back to the point that Samar was making is until we study these things, it's difficult to understand. I don't know how many of you all saw the studies that came out in Science.
Meta studies.
The meta studies, which, and of course those were very small scale studies done over a short duration of 3 months. So, you know, I think there have been questions raised, rebuttals made, but some of those findings are counterintuitive to, you know, on questions of virality, etc., that we would have sort of thought as researchers in this space. So I guess the thing is, until we study these things in more detail, it's hard to know what the impacts are, whether people are migrating to other smaller applications, if the value of social media applications and communications applications is around network effects, and if one of the major concerns that prompts, you know, internet shutdowns or banning of apps is to minimize the spread of misinformation, which triggers real-world violence and public order situations, you know, perhaps, you know, smaller applications that don't have those kind of network effects and that kind of concentration of people in that region on that application, perhaps that will not matter. But if, you know, concerns are different and it's about stifling the ability of bad actors to communicate with each other, perhaps it will have an impact. But probably those bad actors will find a further application that's beyond, you know, something the government knows to sort of exchange communication. But yeah, I think, you know, when we're talking about proportionality and what we're doing, I mean, there's so many layers. There's, you know, the layer of just shutting down the internet. There's the layer of course, app bans. But then, I mean, if you want to get even more targeted, we have to understand what is the implication of maybe shutting down certain actors or nodes within social media platforms, and of course that has serious freedom of speech and expression concerns, but if we are talking about proportionality, I mean, we would even have to start going to that level of granularity, but then that opens up questions of discrimination, due process, how are these decisions being made, who's making these decisions, and actually some of these things have been pointed to in the standing committee report of information technology in terms of even the review process and the decision-making process around 69A, blocking of websites, etc. And concerns around what is the composition of the committee making these decisions, that it should have members of parliament, it should have judicial members, it should have members of civil society, etc. And it shouldn't only be the executive that is making these decisions. So, questions of proportionality aside, all of this raises questions of due process and the sort of discriminatory application that some of these decisions can have in terms of targeting only certain marginalized groups that stay in a particular location and shutting down their access to internet or communications applications versus other sort of groups that may live in different localities.
To be fair, Delhi also had an internet shutdown during the CAA protests. So
Yeah, just very briefly touch upon
on the
your-
vagueness angle, because Jhalak spoke about this, right? Samad, you're representing a VPN client on that same issue of sort of vagueness in the sense.
True, but I'm bound by my own ethical rules, not
Let's-
ready to get into those issues or live issues too deeply. But
Fair
on the
enough.
larger issue itself, and it ties into Aditi's question and Jhalak's
Samad,
point.
could you go a little bit into what is the kind of specificity you think is needed?
Yeah, in fact, that ties into Aditi's question also. So your question was that, let's say you go after app 1, and then there are app 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there are two scenarios. The simpler scenario is, of course, that the order banning them included several apps, but the action is taken only against one. That's a simple scenario. The person against whom action is taken has a clear grievance that if you've explicitly banned 5, but you're only going after me, that's clear discrimination. So that's a simple scenario. The more complicated scenario is where a decision has been taken by the policymakers to say, okay, this particular app in this particular area for this particular time. Now that ties into Jhalak and Nikhil's point on vagueness and versus specificity. That's why I come back to the order. And that's why I come back to what is the responsibility of the policymaker who's taking this drastic step. To my mind, a order of this nature to be upheld would need to be specific as to the factors that led to the banning order itself and going beyond simple boilerplate language. Now, that doesn't mean that this needs to be like a judgment of a court running into 40 pages. But every decision of the government has to be on the basis of some material. So that ultimately they say that reasons are the lifeblood of every order. So therefore, someone reading it, someone assessing it, and someone possibly wanting to challenge it must know why it was there. So here, if for example, you banned one app and you didn't ban 5, that particular app can come around and say, look here, the things that you said about shifting to other apps, VPNs, etc. And quite apart from that, why have you targeted me? Do you have specific data? Is your order clear and non-vague enough to say that my app in specific was being used by certain people to do certain bad things? That will also compel the government, which in a democratic society is a good thing, to put its cards on the table. If it's doing a particular thing, let's say there are certain groups of bad actors in certain places, of course, subject to the caveats of not giving out secret and confidential information and intelligence and all of that. National security is a word that can be abused equally on both sides. It can be abused by governments as a cover for everything. It can also become, and sadly, the abuse by government makes it into something we then disregard. Whereas national security is actually a very serious thing, which is, according to me, a justifiable reason when there are genuine grounds. But the overuse and the expansive use of it to justify each and every action, it's like crying wolf. Eventually, you stop taking it seriously. And that's the sad part, where it's a very serious thing. So therefore, the specificity and the vagueness argument comes that if we require the orders to be specific, which is already the legal requirement, we're not saying something new, we're not reinventing the wheel. It's just that it's observed possibly in the breach, because what we see, as what we saw in Manipur, is that what the government may have had good reasons, may not have had good reasons. But the orders are boilerplate, and every week the same order is reproduced and published again. That clearly, to my mind, shows a non-application of mine. So had they been more clear, we would also have visibility as to the justification and the rationale behind it, and that particular messaging service would know why it has been targeted versus others, and that may have furnished it a ground of challenge ultimately. That's the importance of, therefore, the giving of reasons and the need for specificity.
I think when it comes to renewing boilerplate internet shutdown orders, Manipur got inspired by Kashmir. Because if I'm not wrong, Rohini Lakshane and Prateek Wagre had done this report, if anyone's interested, about how they were literally a day before, they would just renew the order, exact same language, and if I'm not wrong, there were a couple of orders which had the wrong dates. But I think someone had a question.
So Ivan has a question, and then Rahul has a point to make. Ivan?
Yeah.
Mic's off. Mic's off.
Hello. I just wanted to make a quick point on there is obviously a device level identifier in certain sense in banning apps. Like while she was talking about traveling from Delhi to Jaipur and accessing something that you don't know. Now, it is very hard to identify that, but there has been apps like very recently Threads was banned in Europe, even when users were accessing it through VPN. So you have some, like services especially, has some level of data to identify devices maybe where they were bought from, because Adam Mosseri was using Threads while he was in London. And if they had banned, so he might be using a US phone with an app installed. Even when you install TikTok here, even with VPN, even if you're a clean slate phone, you won't be able to use it unless you have a phone purchased from outside. Then you use a VPN, register, and use TikTok. So that is a point that a lot of times we don't get to know about what device level identifiers are being used when banning an app.
Is that a TikTok level ban or is that an ISP level ban?
I don't think so. It's an ISP level ban because unless you're accessing TikTok from the web.
It's a TikTok level ban. So if an app doesn't want to comply, if that app is not based in India, how will this work?
Yeah, the app has to comply because same way Threads also banned it in Europe because they would.
So it's
also.
different for Threads to ban Threads in Europe, let's say.
Yeah. It's not.
Can Threads ban it in Nainital?
No, not at local level because they don't know your device identifier is from Nainital.
Exactly. So that's a different, because you're talking about one like Jaipur being banned or this thing. So that is a wholly different problem.
No, I'm saying that we actually don't know what device identifiers they know about when banning, services to our devices when we have bought devices from certain region.
So I think he's brought up
Threads
a
knows everything.
He's
sorry.
yeah.
TikTok is also so the Play Store level bans.
You can sideload it. You can use a VPN to download it.
TikTok as a company has not banned it. It is banned by the government at the App Store level or from the download, wherever you can download it. Obviously through VPN, etc., you could access. So it's not at the company level.
Correct, but after Google versus CCI, we will have hundreds of app stores, and therefore you can download it from any app store in the world. Someone is also involved in Google versus CCI.
Then, Nikhil, it will be implemented at TSP level.
Correct. Rahil.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually come in a little bit to build on what Jhalak was also talking about of the standing committee report. There's a lot of conversation now about specific selective banning, but the core of the issue that really exists is one of transparency, accountability, of one of executive action review. And if you look at the standing committee report, one of the key considerations, and Trai has very conveniently looked at the selective banning part bringing in here, but one of the key recommendations they said was to create a database of shutdowns and to actually review those shutdowns. In the action taken report that the government has filed to that, you have the MHA and the DOT very clearly saying, we are not doing this, right? So we're now talking very specifically, and we're kind of shifting the goalpost here, right? When the core of the issue remains, and someone has a brilliant point about national security, right? Important, very important to consider, but where is accountability and transparency in the executive action? And that somehow, I feel like this entire conversation is shifting the core issue that needs to be sort of re-emphasized continuously, right? We don't have data on internet shutdowns officially in the country. Now we're coming in with app ban shutdowns. What's going to happen there, right? Are you just empowering an executive to sort of build on the various actions already taking, right? You're arming them further. So I think like a lot of that conversation is missing. And I think this sort of app ban conversation, selective banning, is a very convenient move away from what you really need to be discussing.
So if I could put it another way, do you think we are approaching a level where we are sedimenting on top of each other the different blocking mechanisms we have? So we have TSP blocking through telecom suspension rules as well as through DOT orders via Section 69A. Intermediary blocking through Section 69A. That could be App Store level, that could be website level, that could be Facebook, Twitter level. And then on top of it, we have what the telecom bill is recommending. Then on top of that, we also have what the DPDP bill is recommending through clause 37. So do you think there's so much...
And rule 14, 15, 16 of the...
They will, like I said in the beginning, there's going to be a central negative registry which will consolidate action across all different types of regulators for bans. And then basically everyone will have to comply with that. So there'll be a cyber protection authority and the central negative registry, which is the construct of the Standing Committee on Finance on Cybersecurity.
If I can go back to the speakers for a minute, do you think such a registry is in line with the Anuradha Bhasin standards about proportionality, about due diligence, about actually considering harm, risk to fundamental rights? Creating such a registry and therefore saying that, oh, look, here's all the information, we are giving it to you, we're being transparent. Does that meet the remit of transparency?
Sorry, a registry of?
Everything that's banned, and at what level?
I think, I think that's a double-edged sword, right? I think if we're talking about transparency, the more important thing to be focusing on is what the gentleman in the back talked about in terms of needing the government to disclose the number of internet shutdowns happening. Because the point is, like, the response in the standing committee report from the DOT was that they don't have that information from state governments, right? It's not impossible for them to do that. They have NCRB data, etc., that they collate from state governments. There are no review committees at state levels around 69A. Not all states have review committees, which then begs to the question of why we have boilerplate templates, because that capacity to engage and understand this at state level may not be there. And if we talk about selective banning of apps, the question that will arise is how, if the state government doesn't have the capacity to make those decisions, how are they going to know which apps to ban or block in a particular situation versus not? And it all begs questions of transparency, due process, decision making being available for scrutiny. I don't know if my other co-panelists have a response to the centralized registry.
So we have a question or a comment here. And if you could, Aditi, also move to that one particular phrase in that consultation paper on the idea of intelligible differentia in the consultation paper. But
No, somebody had a question.
no, you wanted to respond?
That's substantially similar to.
Hi, good evening, everyone. This is not a question, but a submission. First of all, maybe you agree or not, this app bans and network fees that what we are discussing today, this should have been discussed about 7-8 years back. This is my view, actually. Now, why? App bans and network fees, whatever we are discussing today or whatever conclusion the nation comes to, whatever outputs we get, there will be something to it that we will learn later. So what I am coming to is, like in 2019 onwards, Web3, the arrival of Web3 has come, decentralized apps have come, blockchain has come, distributed ledger technologies have come, wherein there are social media apps which do not require any role from ICANN, which do not require any role from any kind of KYC or authentication or verification or validation from anywhere. These are working on decentralized technologies which do not have any kind of centralized control.
So if I can add here, one or two of the 14 messaging apps that were banned in Kashmir, I think 1 or 2 of them were decentralized apps. Yet they managed to do it because it was at TSP level.
Whenever we speak of decentralized apps, they cannot be banned.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
I mean, I mentioned this earlier, back in like end of 2000s, when Google Talk launched, they were based on a protocol called XMPP, Jabber XMPP. And anyone could just take any app, just connect with the protocol like you do in email, and you could basically use your Gmail account to chat on that app or on a site anywhere. So how do you ban a protocol? Anyone can set up an app. Anyone can use a protocol to communicate with any app. When you move to a federated messaging ecosystem, there is, like, to his point, there's no blocking this. No. Like, it's like blocking email. And in fact, when you're talking about the same communication that you're trying to block over messaging, how doesn't that happen on email? That can happen on email anytime, anywhere. So would you also then block all email alongside it?
I think there are answers there.
Yeah. See, which is why this is not an opportune moment. The word used by TRAI just 2 years back when they came up with the recommendations, and now suddenly, for no reason, they have again come up without realizing that there are 2-3 other legislations in process on telecom bill, on Digital India Act, the data protection which has almost come. So, without having any clarity, you are expecting us to respond to all this. And this is, as rightly said, this was something to be considered maybe a few years back. We have progressed much ahead. This is like, more of an academic discussion what we will have at the end of it. So, that's why this was definitely not the opportune moment. We should wait for entire thing to develop and have more progressive questions, if at all required. This is also not the right stage in the market for OTT to be regulated at all.
Just 2 points. One, earlier somebody had said that, okay, if I'm from Delhi and if I'm go to Jaipur, how would they know? Now, there it's very simple. There's something called HLR and VLR. So HLR is home registry and VLR is visitor location registry. So, so the moment we go to a different area, whether nationally or internationally, that's how the roaming works. So it's very simple, and that particular operator, let's say whoever is in Jaipur, if they are blocking it, if you are a user, whether you are a subscriber of theirs in Jaipur or of their services elsewhere, or any of the roaming customer for that matter, of any other operator in India or elsewhere, it will remain blocked because they have blocked it at the network level, number one. Number 2 point to what Nikhil just mentioned about protocols. So there's been an instance about 20 years back where it was not about blocking of a particular protocol, but yes, the intent was towards that. So DOT wanted ISPs to block, to monitor and report value of UDP, which is a particular protocol. And the suspicion was that because this particular protocol is used a lot by VoIP services, and if that UDP value is very high for certain customers, they may like to have additional investigation. And this was a huge sort of burden for the ISPs to undertake. So after a lot of discussion, finally the solution was simple. All that we did was we asked the DOT that, okay, BSN and MTNL, these are 2 ISPs under your direct control, your administrative control. Please implement it there. Once we know how it has been implemented, others will implement it. And to the best of my knowledge, it's been 18 years since then and is yet to happen beyond that.
Arun, you had a
Great
question.
strategy.
Yeah, teach us.
Yeah, so more of a point than anything. I think there have been 3 conditions for either an internet shutdown or an app ban, right? One is social strife, and the other is a direct autocracy. So if when Egypt shut down its internet, and 3, the widespread availability of instant and rich communications between a lot of people. Now, India doesn't yet fully fit into the direct autocracy model, but we do have very widespread communications infrastructure, and that has led to a situation where apps, the communication apps and social media platforms are now freshly confronting a problem that they have never had to confront before, which is that what do you happen when social strife is tearing a state or a country apart, and there is legitimate cause for people to ask you to, turn off access for a while. They don't have to deal with this quandary in places like Egypt or Russia because one is an autocracy, one is invading another country. If you get blocked, you get blocked. That is not a moral question you have to deal with. Now, since 2016, we are in a place where this is both a large platform a large customer base for these companies as well as a socially volatile society. So I think these two have not really coincided in the absence of autocracy in a significant way in the past. So anything here will be fresh territory that we cannot explore in a vacuum, like Samar said.
I think, Jhalak, you may want to come in here because I remember you mentioned how even France is considering banning certain apps given the strife that happened, the rioting that happened under DSA. So if you want to jump in and then Samar.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a trend we are seeing globally, right? I mean, we've debated the traceability question in India. It's something we're seeing come up in the UK as well. Recently, with things that happened in France, we saw statements being made around the blocking of applications under the DSA.
So I'm going to ask for very quick answers, please, because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I think it takes us back to what Samar was saying in terms of, I think the judiciary has also let us down over here by not engaging with questions of proportionality and the way terms like national security, public order, etc., need to be interpreted in the context of, app bans or internet shutdowns, how to deal with questions of social strife within our constitutional structure. And they've sort of sidestepped those issues constantly, and I think that is definitely a letdown from their side.
So I have a quick question for Jhalak. What happens to 69A, and how will this play as a parallel to 69A?
So, I mean, it's something that I've been looking at is, can this be done through the 69A mechanism? And the only thing is that 69A doesn't have an unblocking mechanism per se, right? It only has a mechanism where orders can be rolled back if the review committee or in an emergency provision, the committee disagrees with it. So, but in practice, we know that, for instance, Caravan was unblocked on Twitter. So how did that happen? We don't have enough information and transparency around, how that mechanism works. So I imagine if they really want to set up a system like this, they'd probably have to bring something in through the telecom bill or the DIA to really operationalize this in a very clear manner.
Aditya, I have some just very quick questions around this. One other thing that I'm grappling with is this idea of defining an intelligence differential between defining communications apps and other types of apps, right? So I asked about email. There is, for example, Paytm has messaging for when you make a payment. Zomato has customer care, which is a form of messaging. There are P2P and P2M, different types of messaging apps that exist. There are, on MediaNama, we can put up a chat room. That's a message form of messaging. There are forums that are messaging. What is this idea of trying to figure out an intelligence differential between what is a communications app and what is not a communications app? So, for example, when you look at, and this question is going to run through every session, frankly. When you look at, let's say, WeChat started off as a messaging app, became huge, started e-commerce. At what is the threshold when it stops becoming a messaging app and becomes an e-commerce app? What is the threshold when, in which a commerce app that has communication suddenly, like I used to be on a forum in 1999 called Fresh Time Soda, and that used to be like a publishing website for short stories and poetry and articles from people like 17 to 25 years of age. And then, but the real activity on that used to happen on the messaging board. That's communication. So how, just from a framework perspective, from a legal framework perspective, how do you decide what to ban? And how do you decide what is a communication app that this framework will apply to? How does this work?
Yeah, again, this brings us back to the point you talked about definitional clarity. About, first of all, look, your session, for example, was titled on OTT apps. Now, you go out to the public and you ask them what is an OTT, they'll tell you it's Netflix and Hotstar and all of that. So the concept that over-the-top services encompass more than just, what is commonly known as itself, something that will come as a surprise to most people outside perhaps this space. So, and I don't think there's a very clear, bright line definition of a lot of OTT services and the internal differences between them on some accepted level globally. So as you said, now so many apps are running multiple functions at the same time. I mean, recently we had during the Russia-Ukraine thing, there was a leakage of some important intelligence material on some video game on Discord.
Discord, yeah.
On Discord. I assume that's not the principal purpose of that particular application.
It is.
Yeah, it is.
But
Really?
I'm
Okay.
kidding. There's a lot of leakage and scams and everything on Discord.
Yeah.
You should
Yeah.
check it out. It's
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
So therefore, you're absolutely right. And look, I assume we can't, why we would like to have bright line distinctions for everything. I don't think in the real world we're going to have bright line distinctions for everything. So I suppose from a legislative Benthamite perspective, possibly you lay down a description of what a communication app should be. Possibly it might be that the majority of the service is a communication app as opposed to the minority, because once again, if for example you start permitting, while as I said, I'm not ruling out banning, but at the same time, if you're going to permit the bans of something that's only incidentally used, perhaps your better solution was to target those bad actors.
When have we seen specificity in definitions? Even if you look at the IT rules, the definition of a significant social media intermediary applies to a payment service provider like
therefore,
Paytm.
those are points for experts like you to critique, but that doesn't justify or obviate the need for the answer to all of your problems is to have more specific definitions. And quite frankly,
Correct,
the
but
reason
we won't get it as a problem, right?
Well,
Even
that-
the
that-
definition of messaging, we're not getting it so far.
that perhaps is a separate issue. But let me tell you, go back to a very favorite book of both yours and mine. You go back to Yes Minister and Britain of the 80s. It's not that no government tends towards specificity, because in vagueness lies the elbow room to then do whatever you want. So therefore, that's the constant strife that will always be there. So all we can do is ask for that and challenge what is vague, and perhaps then impel governments to do better. That's all.
I think Maknoon has a point.
What do you
and-
add?
Nikhil, just a point to add here. So if you look at the objectives, they mentioned misinformation and misuse of these platforms for fomenting trouble. So when does misinformation work? It only works when there are significant number of people to whom this misinformation reaches to. So if it's not about banning all the communication apps. It's just about banning some significant players so that the misinformation does not work. Or as the other side might claim, narrative control might work.
It's also about attributing intent, right? Something that is incorrect is not necessarily illegal when it's done with the intent of fomenting something. So if someone's created, for example, a video warning about child abduction in Pakistan, and then someone takes it in India and morphs it to say that someone in your village is going to get abducted and spreads it across the country, and that led in 2016 to 29 people getting killed across India, the entity in Pakistan is not to blame for creating misinformation.
So the context matters. And just adding to what Samar was talking about, the need for specificity that has already been abused by the government of India. The IT rules do not define what messaging is. Rule 4.2 says that finding the first originator is a requirement only for significant social media intermediaries, primarily in the business of messaging. But in the Twitter Section 69A case, the government lawyer argued that when Twitter can't get to the first originator, even though it's mandated to under Rule 4.2, how can we be expected to reach out to the actual user and issue them the blocking order? So that abuse is already there. And you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war. Google Reviews is being used as a messaging service across the border. So what do you do then? Because internet and its services are also dynamic. So even if Venmo is a great example of that, how it's a privacy nightmare because it's communication. But I'm sorry, your question.
Yeah, I was just hoping if we could shed light on the banning of the Chinese apps, insofar as it's also a selective ban on Chinese apps per se, right? And I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have better things to say. I'm just not aware. And I think that the securitarian kind of discourse becomes its own presupposition, which leads to this counterposing of a selective ban against a cascading ban as the only two alternatives that we have. Which becomes then a ground for a kind of narrowing of an unpacking of what forms a solid ground for the banning of apps. So if you could just have a discussion on what is a good legitimate ground for a ban and why do we need it? Do we not have any other mechanisms outside of bans? And also the Chinese experience, please.
Samar?
I mean, look, honestly, obviously there's no one good answer to this. It's a very normative sort of a thing where, sorry, Nikhil? Oh, okay, sorry. Where one can have different views on policy. This is ultimately a policy question, and there you, I, and a third person may disagree. The only test I would say is this a policy? Perhaps a reasonable person, even if he disagrees, would say this is a possible policy interpretation. That's the test I would impose. Now, for Chinese apps, I believe, once again, not being an expert in the field, I believe even for those apps that do that are for innocuous purposes, one possible fear was data collection and the fact that behind the Chinese apps and China being a very peculiar sort of a use case where there is a lot of it is state controlled. So therefore, is it really data mining of Indian customers? That might be a justification the government give. I mean, ultimately, the problem is sometimes the government, even if it may have a good, I'm not saying this government or that government, I'm saying governments in general. Governments in general just choose not to articulate their reasons very well, perhaps because they feel they don't need to. So from the China point of view, I think that perhaps might be a slightly specific use case where I agree at first blush just to say from one country ban everything is not a good idea. But at the same time, if there could be a further justification giving, just playing an advocate for a minute, that there is a rampant case of data phishing and data mining happening of people, that could perhaps furnish a justification for creating a class of apps that you then ban. The problem then is in the overbroadness, I believe, subject to correction. In one of the rounds of the many Chinese apps that were banned, a bunch of Indian apps got banned. And that was, that was just foolishness, right? So that's where your overbroadness will make you make mistakes. And I believe that led to then calls. So there were even some banking or some sort of financial apps that got, fintech apps and all that got banned. So that's where overbroadness gets wrong. But on specific cases like China, etc., I believe governments could have, any government, frankly, across the world could have a justification saying there is data mining happening. That's why I'm doing it. That's why I create a class. But the point is for them to state the reason and for us to test the reason based on whatever our own personal beliefs are, I think.
So if I may just address one part of what you said, there was no ban on Chinese apps. There was a ban on some certain specific identified apps which were not in any shape or form, in any press release, any announcement by the government deemed to be Chinese apps. When there was a ban on Chinese investment in India in April 2020 or March 2020, there was no ban on Chinese investment. There was a ban on, there was a government review approval process being put into place for investment coming in from countries with physical boundaries or physical borders with India. So even there was no specificity that this is a Chinese app being banned.
I think what she's saying is it's more of a pick a card, any card situation where
Yeah.
really at the end we know at the end why it is, and that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong. As I said, rather than doing this circuitous thing, I'd be happier if it was just done directly, especially when you may have a justifiable reason to create a class and you can actually hold that up.
Chinese intelligence law allows the government of China to commandeer any company in China towards the purpose of national security. That's reason enough when there's a...
Not just for national security, to check it's a pretty broad exemption. It can be for anything under the sun.
Exactly. So
Backdoor
under those
access.
circumstances, if India is in a state of border clashes with China, India has every right to ban Chinese apps. So like Samar is saying, say it. There's nothing wrong with saying it.
So your question, and then Maknoon, you had a point. Oh, okay, then.
Thank you. I just wanted to make two quick points. One is primarily related to Samar's point, how rule of law and digital constitutionalism related developments that are taking in Europe have not sort of reflected within the new IT rules or all the legislation that have sort of been incorporated. Henceforth, the substantive and procedural rights, the way they should be understood in the context of ICT technologies, have not been understood so broadly. The reason that there is confidentiality clause within blocking rules is sort of justifies or sort of juxtaposes that point that procedural rights have not been understood at all. And in the Madhyam broadcasting case that recently Mr. Justice Chandrachud sort of adjudicated on, he tried to expand what is understood by proportionality and how to expand that and apply that to procedural rights as well, how procedural rights have to be also satisfy the test of proportionality as well. And that sort of ties down to the other point that Samar and Jhalak have been talking about. Specific, and I sort of disagree with the discussion here. The specificity is not required in the law. The specificity is required within the order itself. Because I think, and this is again ties back to the specific question about intermediary classification that we were discussing, I don't think we should have a very specific definition of each and every type of functionality of an app. The way a app or a service has to be determined has to be through its dominant functionality and has to be done at a court level, because your safe harbor protection, when you're trying to prove to the court that you have satisfied safe harbor protection, you go to the court and you actually do that. So that is where you sort of define your dominant functionality. And this is why DSA also has broad terminologies of what is a hosting platform, what is an online platform as well. And that's why I slightly just disagree. I don't think there has to be very specific categorization of each classification of intermediaries, because that fails to incorporate a future advancement and just platforms that are very multifunctional, so to speak. Yeah, those are the two primary points.
Any other questions?
No, I actually agree with him. No, I agree with him. The specificity should give... Oh, sorry. No, I actually fully agree with him, because the specificity I'm saying is that you first define what a communication app is, but insofar as the dominant purpose, because the reality is right, apps are multifunctional, right? So I'm just saying we can't, that's why I said you can't have bright lines for everything. You have a common sense definition that sets out what a communication app is. The moment an app that happens to offer 10 more functionalities, the dominant purpose of that, whether by design or even by usage, starts to become communication, that should perhaps fall within net. I mean, it's a common sense approach. Ultimately, we don't need to be too complex or over complexify things. It's just a common sense approach to these things at the end of the day. But I wholly agree with him.
Any other questions or comments? Sorry. Yes. Oh, okay. Just two final points. Sir in the black shirt, and I think Mahesh, sir. I don't know. Sure. I'm losing my eyesight.
Sure. So one way in which such a categorization could play out is by, say, looking at not only the user base, but the way in which different apps are dependent on each other. Say, for example, in an area, even though the number of Twitter users would be less, it may be enough for them to download a certain viral video on Twitter and then flood it over on WhatsApp and on Instagram. So thus kind of codependence between apps and the way and the rate at which they can make a certain post viral can itself serve as a branch for categorization. Now this will obviously exclude your payments app where like communication can happen, but none of this is going to be effective enough. So I think on a context basis as well, but on a functional basis as well, such apps which are codependent on each other and which are more prone to virality can be identified. So yeah.
That's an interesting point. If you're ever interested, look up this Telegram channel called Meg Updates, Meg Updates, and that actually puts out, oh, this is the kind of misinformation you should make viral. Of course, pro certain party, but yeah. So.
No, you will soon discover I'm not an expert in this, but let me just make a couple of points. One is simply that I think we may be getting the wrong end of the stick by saying that this is that selective banning of apps is difficult or impossible to do, because I think the state is quite happy with an imperfect result, and that is typically what the state has always done. I mean, all of us know that every time such an attempt is made, there are some people who kind of, or some apps, some people, some institutions somehow manage to go through the net. So I think whether or not it is possible to do perfectly, whether it is technically impossible to do, etc., is not really the issue at all. The real issue really is about institutional intent, government, including institutions, including the government, intent, objectives that they're supposed to fulfill, and their capacity to do so, and finally their accountability. Really, that is what we must be focusing on, in my opinion. And the larger point, not the larger point, but a different point that was made, I would actually very counterintuitively suggest that specificity might actually be a problem rather than the solution. Because this is something that actually is going to tie us in knots all the time, given the nature of technology. So what we do want is clearly laid out principles in our, whether it is in our regulatory literature, regulatory orders, whether it's in court orders or government policy making. We want them to specify clear objectives so that a competent court or a competent regulator can interpret them this thing. So that is why we have, I think, a stake, a very high stake in institutional capacity and institutional autonomy, which unfortunately is something that we are struggling with. We are not doing a great job. And I think we have actually been let down, I think as Jhalak also pointed out, by our judiciary and sometimes even by our regulators and government departments. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I think what he basically meant to say was, please correct me if I'm summarizing it incorrectly, that the government just wants to flex. So if it wants to come after Twitter, even if Google and Facebook are not in compliance as well, it will come after Twitter, and these are enabling provisions. And I think you are in the majority there when you say that perhaps we need a principle-based approach and not specific approach, because I think Samar also agrees with you, the gentleman in the black, and I can see a few people nodding their heads as well. I think this is a good note to end on. Not very optimistic because we're talking about government's might, but it's okay. So thank you. Thank you, Maknoon. Thank you, Jhalak. Thank you, Samar.
Thanks. So we'll move straight on to the next one, which is on net neutrality. And given that, so we contacted a bunch of telecom operators for this discussion, but they couldn't make it. So I'm also joining the panel. I'd like to invite Rahil, Vakasha, Amrita for this discussion. Vakasha is going to moderate the session. Arun, you have questions? Also would like to request everyone to come up in front. Empty seats up in front here.
I know we're not as interesting as the last panel, but maybe there'll be some fun here. Today we have the great champion of telco rights and the person who doesn't believe in net neutrality, Nikhil Pava, on this panel. I'm sure you guys will all be wanting to hear his amazing arguments for why exactly we need network usage fees. And thank you everyone for joining. I know the temptations of the water table and the tea table and the squeezy balls will be very high right now. But yeah, I think, look, I think it's a bit of a tough act to follow the last session because the last one was on a, let's just say, more exciting topic. But I think as we were just discussing, that there's so many issues with tech policy these days which may not seem the most sexy or seem the most interesting or exciting, but there's some pretty big consequences to those depending on which way they go. And I think this is one of those issues which we're looking at today, which is coming out of a TRI consultation paper, which itself comes out of a long set of discussions which have been pushed by the telcos for a very long time, who were supposed to be here to defend their position, but we don't have them, unfortunately. But basically the idea being, should you have a system where the poor telcos who've lost all that calling and all that messaging which we used to all do and care about our SMS limits and have to worry about minutes, should that be, sorry.
I have data.
Nikhil has data.
So I put together some data yesterday, last time before this panel, and I know it's selective, but I looked at one telecom operator, which was the number one operator at that time and is now the number two operator, which is Airtel. In FY16, which is financial year ending March 30th, 2016, Airtel had an average revenue per user of 194 rupees per user. They now have an average revenue per user of 193. India voice minutes at that point in time were 307,988 million minutes of voice. They are now 1.124 billion minutes of voice. I know that doesn't sound right, but that's what it is. So India voice minutes is up 3.6x. Voice usage per customer per month is 2.7 times of what it was in 2016. Total MBs on network is 9.7 times of what it was in 2016. Total revenue is 5.3 times of what it was in 2016. EBITDA profit is 6.5 times of what it was in 2016. And the most important figure, which indicates profitability for Airtel, EBITDA as a percentage of total revenue is now 52%. In 2016, it was 41.4%. So if in its submission, Airtel at any point in time argues that it is struggling or it is losing money, the numbers don't bear it out. And during the net neutrality consultation, at that point in time, you had a situation where Airtel was telling the TRAI that it doesn't have money, that it's losing money, blah, 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 blah. And at the same time, in their investor conference calls, they were talking about how great things are. So what they tell a regulator is very different from what the numbers say and what they tell their investors. And these are numbers that are culled out from their financial reports for 2023, that's ending March this year, versus 2016, which is the year that in Feb 2016, the net neutrality consultation verdict on differential pricing came out. So they have grown since then. Vodafone Idea has struggled since then. And I would attribute this situation where some operators are struggling to a purely competitive scenario and nothing more. So if you can't fight your competition, it's not the job of the public or the regulator to basically rescue you. It's a competitive market scenario.
Nikhil, even the TRAI consultation paper actually projects that itself. It says that the ARPU for wireless services from 2012 to 22, as in, has grown 44%. Okay, it was rupees 98, it grew to 141. From 2014 to 2022, the volume of monthly wireless data usage increased 156 times. And from 2014 to 2022, the average revenue from data usage or wireless subscribers grew 5 to 6 times. This is the consultation paper saying. So I really don't know what is reality, figures or the words.
So I think this really points to the fact that this is supposed to be a discussion which should be having multiple sides, but does it really have a lot of sides? I think the numbers, as Nikhil's pointing out, they don't really give much of an indication. Even the TRAI itself doesn't seem to have numbers which indicate anything more. And to be fair, I guess the paper itself doesn't actively, openly, directly advocate for it. It's saying, okay, let's have a conversation. Though, of course, you have to ask, why should you, I mean, what is the need for this when there is no debate? But I guess perhaps this is a good opportunity for us to get this sort of information out there, that there is no real basis for it. So if you do start having the telcos come to you and be like, guys, you know, it's so bad, nobody uses SMS anymore, everyone's using Signal, everyone's using WhatsApp, they're still fine, right? And I think the question then becomes, is there any legitimate reason for telcos to be worried about, or you know, your internet service providers among telcos to be worried about OTT services? And of course, that begs the second question, which is about the scope of this paper. That is the scope of this paper where it specifically is trying to look at OTT communication services the right way? Or is there any world in which perhaps there is a conversation to be had about other OTT services, which maybe are creating a problem for the telcos, or are cutting into what the telcos do? Raheel, do you have anything you want to?
So I think what the concern for the telcos are and where the entire network usage fee comes in, you're right in pointing out that the tri-paper per se does not comment on or suggest to invoke a network usage fees. The one mention that you have of it is in context of the Berwick report, which actually sort of refutes the idea of you know, network usage fees, and that's where it sort of comes in. It poses it there, but it brings it in. The larger conversation you've seen about around network usage fees is from telcos, right? And that entire conversation is linked to an investment into the infrastructure that they're saying is skewed, that you don't have infrastructure investments made by OTT platforms, you only have them being made by telecom, and that burden is excessive. Now, if you take a step back as to what is the real reason why we're having this conversation around regulating OTT communication services per se, right? And the idea is, and it's sort of the leveling the playing field, same service, same rules, having that entire bit, but at the core of it, and I think where the regulator and where the telcos find sort of synergy is about encrypted communication, right? Is about safe, secure communication, where today you have a state where OTT communication provides an alternative which is secure, that other communication by just virtue, you don't have the number, you maybe not have the facts of it, but you know that it's not, that it's open to interception at any time, you don't have clarity on it, you don't have transparency on it, you don't have accountability on it. So you have these two, and now a TSP for the regulator, for the government, there's a clear intent to come in and have encrypted communication and look at that sort of problem being solved. And for a telco, you have that one offering that they cannot provide. So you're looking at bringing in rules to them to sort of bring them onto the same field where you lower the value of the service that they are providing. You take away that USP that OTT communication services provide, right? And if you actually look at what network usage fees is related to, specifically across the globe, and you look at any sort of other conversations, it's about traffic generation, right? That's the dominant thought that it prevails around network usage fees is around traffic generation. OTT communication, about how much traffic is generated, right? So you're looking at, if you look at the European consultation, the phrase they use is LTG, right? Large traffic generators. They don't use communication. They're not singling out anyone. So you have a conversation over there where the people who are the larger, the 5, 6 people, the OTT services that they're sort of the online services that they've identified to be the larger generators of traffic, and they are the ones who they're looking to seek network usage from. The trial paper is only talking about it from a communications perspective, right? And I think that's something which that sort of difference in how you're even looking at the conversation is important to bring in.
I think that's a key point here, because I think there is, I mean, some of the more, I think, let's just say the more convincing papers which are co-sponsored by or secretly sponsored by Telefonica about all these issues around the world, they do point out that, okay, what about how, since 2014 and stuff, you look at the increase in the amount of traffic you have for just for using a video app, for using a Netflix, or for streaming your video on Instagram. There is a need, there is a total change in the way the internet is being used by people with that increase in video, and therefore there needs to be an increase in the burden on those guys, because those guys are making all the money out of that, so why shouldn't the telcos who are sort of providing the vehicle? But if you frame it purely about comms, that doesn't really work, right? Because is that really there? Like Amrita, I mean, in terms of the burden which a comms app has on a service, is that really going to be that big?
So I'll take in two things here, as in when you're saying, your first question which ties, the first question which you were asking that the relation between OTTs and telcos, it's symbiotic. If you look at it today, my Vodafone telco does not charge me for SMSs or voice. They are earning from me from data. So this is their business strategy, that they will earn money from data. If their voice revenue or SMS revenue is decreasing, that's because they are not charging me that way. They know where the money comes from. That's one thing. Now, if I go to Europe, for example, Analysis Mason did a report where they said between 2018 to 2021, the network-related investments, when telcos made an investment of 3%, the network traffic increased by 160%. It means ISPs don't have to invest so much to gain that kind of, with a very small amount of investment, they can have more growth in their networks. For example, when we had COVID, none of the telcos or ISPs invested additional in their infrastructure, but they could manage the increased bandwidth because they use it at a particular level, but there is also a maximum level to which it can go. The entire pipe is not used always. So, they need to invest in their infrastructure. Every business has to do it. Even if you have a retail shop, you will have to rehaul it after some time to attract customers. That's how business works. Now, if you look at the conversations which happened in Europe, they are talking, as he mentioned, on the traffic which is flowing. Even there are contentions. The smaller ISPs do not want it. Civil society, consumer groups have written expressing, this would affect network neutrality. Even the Dutch government has written that their concerns, saying that it may affect net neutrality. And there are about 64 MEPs who have written back to expressing their concern. So it is not a 0-1 game. There are different dimensions to it also. If you look at Korea, for example, when they started it, normally what happens is ISPs have, they have a peering which goes on, which is a mutual thing which they have. But what Korea introduced initially was, the big five, say Meta, Google, Kakao, and Naver, and I think Netflix. They had to get into an agreement, and they paid a particular amount of fees for the data to move. Then subsequently what they did was they introduced in 2021, 22, what they wanted is all OTTs, as in everyone has to pay a particular fees for their traffic to move through the network. The concerning part out there is that even after paying, the OTT is responsible for the quality of services. It goes to the customer. And what they ultimately did is then an ISP can say that they will not take, not carry the data of a particular service provider if they do not pay. Does India want to go to that scenario? Now, so what is happening is there is a slower latency in Korea because amongst the OECD countries because of this. Why? Because many service providers are routing it. There are smaller apps, etc., who have moved their business, who have taken the servers outside and are pushing the content from there so that they do not have to pay the fees. The investment in the network has gone down. So there are various aspects coming in. And when we look at India, we are seeing only OTT communications coming in. And I completely agree with him. It is because someone wants to break encryption and get to know who is the person who is sending the information. And nowhere does it, when we are talking about network usage fees, easing woes of telco, we need to look at the other issue, and perhaps we'll go to that. No data today provides this kind of, I would say no data reflects that if you charge network usage fee, all the issues of telcos will be solved, and whatever money they are earning from it, the entire money will be spent in developing the infrastructure.
So I think that you brought up Korea as a good example. They're pretty much the only one who's actually done this. Oh, sorry. So Korea is basically the only country which has properly actually implemented this system, even though conversations are happening elsewhere. But with Korea, I think that one interesting question might be to ask is that prior to them making it something for everyone, was it still something burden? Was it creating like issues for consumers and for others in the country to access those OTT things when it was when it was based on traffic? It was based on, has there been a difference in the, was it okay for consumers then, and then subsequently when they made it for all, there was a problem, hence the attempts to route through Japan and stuff? Or?
As far as I recall, and what I've read, and I may be completely wrong, we understand that the cost for the customer has gone up. Mm-hmm. It has not gone down. If we are saying slower latency, it means that customers not getting the kind of service which they are supposed to get, amongst others. Obviously, Korea has faster speed than us in most of the things. Is the consumer benefiting? I doubt it. Routing of the traffic is obviously a business case for the person who is providing it. Obviously, if you're routing traffic outside, there would be some latency which would come, but then everyone has to see how businesses thrive.
Where in the world does an infrastructure service provider operate at an EBITDA margin of 52% profit, right?
When they're very poor.
You have
very
that,
poor, those poor guys.
Yeah, you have that in India. So if you're saying that they're having a financial problem, they're not. If you're saying that they need to be paid for network infrastructure, what, you're trying to push that EBITDA margin from 52% to 65%? Doesn't work like that, right? If it's just a question of trying to make more money, through regulation. And that was the attempt way back when. In 2015, when this argument came up, at the Save the Internet campaign, we put the exact same numbers before the try. And we basically said that the only thing that really changed this market is going to be competition. And India at that point in time had the most expensive internet access in the world. And telcos were actually arguing that zero rating will help reduce internet access costs. Guess what? Competition did it. Sure, we went down from 8 telecom operators, from 13 in 2008 maybe, to about 8 in 2012, post the 2G scam judgment, to eventually maybe 4, out of which 2 are really functional now. But where in the world do you find that there are, 8 infrastructure service providers?
But I mean, could it be argued that that the reason why that those costs have come down for consumers is anti-competitive practices by one, which of course our competition commission hasn't found that, but like let's assuming that there is. So the argument then becomes, but I mean, of course that won't
depends on
change.
which lens you look at it, right? One can say that that's actually a competitive practice, because at that point in time, and this we pointed out in our submission, Airtel, Idea and Vodafone collectively used to change their internet access rates together and literally by the same amount. And so we argue that there was a cartel in operation at that point in time in terms of internet access prices. You had Jio coming in, competing with everyone else, giving internet access free for a month, making calling completely free and saying we'll become a data operator, and changing the way the entire ecosystem works. So it is actually not anti-competitive activity, it's actually competitive activity which has changed India's internet landscape. And that has happened despite a net neutrality regulation, if you look at what the telcos were saying. Okay. So has internet access grown? It has the amount of data being accessed increased? It has. Have speeds improved? It has. If you look at every single metric, except for the profitability of Vodafone Idea, and maybe some telecom operators getting shut down, there is still heavy competition going on even now. Jio last month launched a low-cost smartphone, and Airtel on its earnings conference call a couple of weeks back said, we're not competing in that market. We're not going to target a feature phone consumer base. So be it, but it is a competitive market. There are 2 operators which are trying to gain market share from each other. That was literally not the case back before Jio launched. So I think, I actually don't understand. The only logic for me in terms of asking for this network usage fees is basically telecom operators trying to change the kind of regulatory burden that they have.
Yeah.
And saying that, like we have quality of service requirements, online apps don't. We have network costs, online services don't. We have to pay a revenue share on our AGR, and the AGR judgment basically destroyed a lot of telecom companies in India, simply because of the kind of penalties that it imposed. And frankly, I disagree with that judgment. I think there should have been a clear separation of what is telecom fees and what is VAS fees. And that was entirely based on charging for services which are not core telecom services under the license. So, you're trying to address a problem caused by a judgment through trying to say, hey, bring someone else under the framework and get them to pay us because we have to pay the government. And the government's written off its AGR, it's in some cases, right?
I mean, that judgment was delivered by the great Justice Arun Mishra. How can we possibly criticize what a great judgment that was with the amazing things that it did?
I'm not criticizing it, I'm just disagreeing with it.
I mean, anyone here, any sensible person obviously disagrees with Nikhil, because obviously any judgment by Justice Arun Mishra was amazing and does great things for the country. I think what's interesting is that I thought maybe we'd arrive at this at a point later in the discussion about, oh, this is what this is really about and what the real things are, but I think we've already reached there. So I think we can possibly change what we're going to look at here and then say, okay, is there any reason, so assuming for a moment that, we get rid of this idea of telcos being regulated. Is there any sensible framework for OTTs to pay a share or do something different? Or would that always lead to a problem for the consumer and for other people? So Rahil, in terms of the cost.
I think like when you frame it as a payment to to a telecom service, it's problematic, right? There are already existing arrangements, commercial arrangements that exist and thrive between telecoms and OTT players. These are across, you have your bundling arrangements, you have your peer sharing arrangements, you have investments, huge investment arrangements which are being made into infrastructure, right? And I think one of the things that you need to realize now is that the internet infrastructure is not just restricted to the boundaries of this country, right? It flows across the globe. And that's really where you see the investments that come in. You see a lot of the online services and application providers spending immense amounts of money in that investment over there. So I think the minute you start looking at the need to having a regulated payment structure model in any form, you're immediately going to start, going down the net neutrality route where eventually the end user is the victim, right? And I want to just go back to Korea for a little bit. Korea, the main opposition that started sort of generating was from their content creator economy, right? It has a massive content creator economy that was getting into huge issues because the quality of, say, YouTube, for example, suffered immensely. So that was where the opposition came into. So in all the conversation that you actually see between, telcos and OTTs and how should they be regulated and how should their arrangements be working, at the end of the day, as a regulator, what is your concern, right? What's the harm we're looking to address? What is the harm we're going to create by these regulations? And at the end of the day, it's the user, right? If you have this sort of arrangement, where is that money going to come from? It's going to be pushed on to a user. You're going to have that sort of, you're going to have the user being the person who's going to be paying more for services, right? In a country like India, and that's also where the European market differs from. In a country like India, where you still have like, where the urban sectors are still, say, for example, have sort of been looked at and have been sort of, you've had a lot of value generation coming from urban centers. You're now moving into the rural areas. Imagine increasing the costs of services in rural areas. You're not going to have the same buy-in on the internet and the entire digital ecosystem. So I think it's important to sort of just keep in mind what is the regulator looking at, right? Because you can have the regulatory intent of the teleco can be very different from what the regulatory intent of the regulator should be, right? The intent of the regulator should be one that focuses on what is the harm, right? And we're talking, what Nikhil and Amrita pointed out in terms of the figures. What is the harm that is currently being caused, right? And I just don't see where that conversation coming in. So right now, all the conversation that is being generated is essentially a diversion, right? You're looking essentially to bring in OTT communication apps within a licensing framework. You're looking to put the regulatory burden that exists on telecoms, and that is an issue. That is the core issue that you must, that it would be really great if TRAI sort of came back and looked at it, right? And I just want to go back. In response to the EU consultation, the US government through the NTA has actually commented on it. And one of the things that the US government has, and the US itself is looking at fair share, as there is a bill that has been brought in called the FAIR Act. And the bill's first primary sort of need is to have an assessment, is to actually have a thorough regulatory assessment about what is the problem you're looking to solve. And is a fair share, network usage fees or any way, in however you want to describe it, is that the solution? And I think currently we're really struggling as to figure out what is the problem that we're trying to address.
So if the real thing which the telcos want is to reduce their burden and reduce their costs, is there a way for that to be something which is actually done rather than take us into this conversation where we're talking about an issue which we're having to get into this whole debate over an issue?
Could you repeat your last question? What was the question you asked before?
So before I was asking that, is there a way to build a framework? Is there any collaborative framework idea? So I'm trying to explore, are there reasons or are there issues for the OTTs and these guys to actually have some sort of collaborative framework where they're...
But so the thing is that a collaborative framework already exists. That collaborative framework is the framework under which the internet today operates. So I run a website. It could be a personal website, it could be a business website, it could be an app. That app is being served out of a computer of mine, which is called a server. For that server to access the internet, I have to buy bandwidth. Sometimes when I'm buying a server space from a cloud service provider, they bundle in bandwidth along with the server that I'm renting from them to run my computing service. And then that ISP that it connects to, and quite often I don't even know which ISP it is, charges either me directly or most commonly charges the hosting service provider. So I'm paying my hosting service provider for bandwidth, who is paying the ISP through a bulk agreement that they have. And then that ISP has got peering agreements across the world, from ISP to ISP to ISP to ISP, until if you're accessing my service, it comes to you. And for you, in order to access that service, you pay your direct ISP. So the way the internet architecture works is that everybody pays at the edge, right? So if there has to be an arrangement where for me to run a site from my computer, I have to pay your ISP for you to be able to access it, then I have to pay, as Mr. Maheshwari said, 2,000 ISPs in this country. In which case, I will prioritize that, hey, I'm going to be available on these 3 ISPs and I'm not going to be available on all of these other ISPs, which means that there will be, and as we've made an argument there will be an Airtel internet, there will be a Jio internet, there will be a Vodafone Idea internet, there will be Spectra internet, and each will be based on different arrangements. And so I might be in a situation like I would be if I was in Africa, where if I had to call a particular person, they need to be on the same network as me, in a sense, or a network with which I have an arrangement, right? In Africa, in some countries, and Airtel found this out when they went to Africa, people have to have multiple SIM cards to be able to call people on other networks. So it basically breaks down the fundamental interconnection of the internet. Secondly, let's not forget, I am paying my edge ISP already. Now I have to pay each of these other ISPs. So I might actually be paying twice or thrice or 4 times. So I'm not free riding. So telecom operators, one of the main arguments they make is that these guys are free riding on our networks. I'm not free riding. I'm paying. I'm just not paying you. You are already getting paid through a peering arrangement. You want to do double charging. That's it.
So I think it's pretty clear that there's no real genuine commercial reason for this. I mean, if we're looking at genuine commercial reason as not being absolutely greedy and completely capitalistic, but so I think the other argument is, okay, what about having funds for infrastructure development, right? Like, and is there a need to contribute to that? So sure, you're not paying on a regular basis for things, but should there be a need to do that, since, we do need to still improve digital infrastructure? There have been issues with being able to, I think there have been multiple reports about how, across India there's different speeds of the internet to a large extent. So there's a genuine need for infrastructure development here, which may be quite different from the way it's going to be in certain other countries. But so what would be the challenges and pitfalls of that? Saying that, okay, look, we want to kind of bring in something to build towards infrastructure. That's the sort of the way in which they can try to garner some sympathy for this. Amrita, what would be the consequences of doing that, and is there any way to do that in a sensible manner, or is it always just going to be a...
So if I look at it, I think this entire discussion is about gaining more power, who has more negotiation power in the table. But if you're talking about building infrastructure, etc., and I agree, what was earlier mentioned, that we need to go to the actual issue. The regulations which telecom providers today have are many. For example, there needs to be reform. The spectrum policy needs reform. The way the AGRs are calculated need reform. As in, there has to be some reforms. If those reforms happen, the woes of telecom providers would ease a lot, and from 2 we would perhaps have a thriving 3 telecom provider. That is one thing. If we want a better ecosystem and not trying to do piecemeal things, we need to go to the crux of the issue, address it, perhaps have some deep assessments, as in it is a known fact, but if still regulators want assessment, they need to do it, and they need to address those issues. Charging so high a spectrum, not giving spectrum which is lying unutilized, which other countries are, I think those are things to be looked at. You have a USO fund lying, which the telecom operators are paying. What is happening to it? Should it not be used when infrastructure has to be made, or should it only be given to Power Grid or Railtel? Why cannot it not be given to the others who are building infrastructure? Why is that money not utilized when telcos are suffering? Okay.
So I don't see why the USO fund should go to uh, another telecom operator that is struggling. I really don't.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you want to build infrastructure, you can invest in infrastructure in such a way that the infrastructure is built. Today, whatever money has been spent or not spent from the USO fund, it is questionable what has happened. We all accept it is not being used in that manner. I'm saying taking money from someone to spend somewhere to develop infrastructure, will that not, has that analysis been done that, okay, if say an OTT is paying for developing infrastructure here, is the OTT not spending to build the infrastructure to bring it here, or the CDNs or the deep sea cables, etc., to carry in? Because just laying the fiber is not the end all and the all of a customer getting the experience they want in an app. There are other things also which goes in, and this has been proved that the OTTs or the service providers are also investing hugely to get that experience. It is just not the pipes only which are investing.
So I'm a great believer in competition. Competition builds infrastructure. If you go back to when Jio launched, and just 6 months before Jio launched, Airtel started an initiative called the One Network Initiative. At that point in time, they started improving their infrastructure at breakneck speeds, to the extent that Airtel infrastructure everywhere across the country improved drastically. Why? Because they were afraid of Jio, right? Many of us have remained with Airtel as customers because their infrastructure is probably better than Jio even in places, right? So competition builds infrastructure. Donations don't necessarily bring about the most efficient outcomes. I'm not saying I'm against the idea of donations for a good cause, but building telecom infrastructure when competition is also a solution is not necessarily a good cause. The other thing about the USO fund is that I don't understand why internet services need to contribute to a USO fund. Can we do a study? And there have been studies actually. In fact, I believe they've been. You look at Parliament and the rollout of what is that BharatNet, right? Yeah. It's extremely inefficient, virtually useless. What benefit has this infrastructure rollout really brought to internet access in India as opposed to competition? The other thing is that when we talk about reducing the burden on telecom operators, let's not forget about where this started from. Telecom operators got free licenses and were told that they only have to pay an AGR, right, as a percentage of their revenue, which means if they made money, they have to give. They walked into this with their eyes wide open. And when it was beneficial for them, it was beneficial. But the flip side of any revenue sharing arrangement, and every vast company knows this, that the more they sell, the more they have to give to telcos. That it comes with a burden. When they buy a license, they buy an exclusive license. The license is exclusivity. Every service online does not have exclusivity. They earn their customer base. Telecom operators have an exclusivity where we don't have enough choice. If every app could buy spectrum and be deployed in this country, I would say sure, like let them compete. But every app can't. That's why you have exclusivity with access service providers. We should not forget that telecom operators are access service providers. They are not internet apps. They're in that business, and they are also in that business. Airtel has a music service called Wink. Now it can't go out and Wink, for example, was competing with radio. Radio operators could have gone and said, hey, They're unlicensed. They're running a music service. Same logic, right? So your mobile balance was being used to buy services. Wallet companies with a license could have argued, hey, we have an RBI license that's used to purchase things. Here, telecom operators without a license are allowing people to purchase things, right? So the point is, these are imperfect substitutes.
Yep.
Telecom operators have exclusivity that they've walked into with their eyes wide open. The terms and conditions for getting that license is already, like that was there, that is still there. They know what they've signed up for. Now to say, regulate someone else who doesn't have your exclusivity and bring them under the same burden as you that has exclusivity is disingenuous.
So Amrita, you have
Yeah,
something to add on to
I
this?
want to add on to it, and that brings in the dimension of the question of licensing, which comes in for OTT communication apps. And the question is, as Nikhil was pointing out, the access providers or telcos have certain, I would say, advantages, like they have spectrum, they have other aspects which they get through the license. Is the OTT also going to get a license? Is it to the spectrum, etc.? As in, then they would not be needing any Airtel or the Geos, as in, why is even a license being discussed? Those are certain aspects which come up. So I think these, we may have, many people may want, or many industries may want many things, but it has to be thought out how it works. And in the entire game, I don't think the end user expenses, etc., is being, discussed at this point of time, which is crucial. Especially, we have the cheapest rates, yes, but A4AI did a study and found that while it is cheap, but it is not cheap for all of India to use, as in it may be cheap for you and me to use data, but not for the whole of India. So I think if we want all citizens to be using internet the way we want, using the government services, etc., Digital Bharat, perhaps this is not the right road we are going into.
I also just wanted to comment on the use of and this idea of contributions to it, right? Currently, we're discussing OTT communication apps. Who else contributes to the use of, right? Because if the idea is to build infrastructure that you're using, OTT communication apps are one form that are using it. Do you start charging everyone on the internet? What is the threshold that you put in place over there for it? How does those questions also are important to sort of get into when you're saying, when you're looking at bringing a concept in of a contribution to a fund. Today it's OTT communication services, tomorrow it moves on to other sort of services and applications in the digital economy. And with a country like India that is sort of pushing the digital economy as, a huge vehicle for the entire economic growth, and you're having startups being promoted and you're doing all of that, eventually what you're going to say is when you get big enough, you're going to start paying for it, right? And if that is the sort of logic you're going for, is that where you want to go? Is that the sort of incentive that you want to give from a government as well, right? Is that the messaging you want to give?
And also, if we are looking at, the startups growing, etc., say, for example, the telcos and the big service providers have agreements, what would happen to the startups, etc., which we are talking about? That is something which needs to be looked at. And again, if we go back to the term also of OTT communication, it's a misnomer. A gaming company also has chatting services, though it may not be the main thing which is being used, but it is being used. While we may in our ways say, okay, it is WhatsApp, it is the Signal or some others, but even this term is slightly a misnomer because services are used in different ways and different forms. So that classification is also kind of a tricky thing.
Arun has 1,000 questions.
Yeah, I was gonna just check, since we started this late, do we have a bit extra time on the panel, or are we gonna be
I'm open with, depends on the others. I'm open, we can go back and forth.
Okay, cool. So because I think, look, I think we've got, the issue on this was pretty clear, and I think we've heard very compelling arguments about why this is there aren't any genuine sort of reasons for this to happen. I mean, that there are, and that therefore this is a debate which we have to think about in terms of being able to make sure people understand why this is not a genuine conversation which is being attempted to be had. So Arun, I know you have some questions now. So
yeah, so more submissions actually. So
Amrita ma'am, you said that this was a matter of power. I will go one step further and actually say this is B2B class warfare in 3 different layers. One, you have the infrastructure layer, and you have the service layer, which is the meta, the platforms, and then you have the content layer. And this is the third belligerent in this war that this panel probably missed out, and that is news media, which has had some success in getting these extractive demands to some extent fulfilled. In Australia, we were able to get news publishers paid a little more from big tech platforms.
They're probably going to manage here as well, Arun.
Yeah, they'll manage. That's not the yeah, and now Canada. And but again, that is a value judgment for a society to make. Is the news valuable enough that we will take one industry's spoils and transfer it to another? Now, let us make that value judgment with the infrastructure layer, which is telcos. Now, telcos are trying to behave like airports when they should be behaving like train stations. The reason being, train stations, you go and you want to buy food, the prices are heavily regulated, everything you buy is at MRP, and even some level of fraud in that process can be survived. Airports, they say, okay, air travel is not a human right, so you buy floor space on an airport on market rates, and since you know that you have a lot of high value customers coming for air travel, you are willing to pay more, and then the customers in turn are willing to pay more. The infrastructure layer for telecom.
They print higher MRPs at airports.
Absolutely. They reduce the water by like 50 ml, and that's a whole new SKU, and now you can charge more, right? And that's the problem, is that telecom has only recently become so big that we are now using it as infrastructure. So now this the value decision we have to make as a society is this a municipal service like the Delhi Gel Board, or is this an airport, right? Where we have a certain level of claim over this, and it should, whether or not, telcos should stay in their auqat. That is the central question before we get into having other industries kind of reward them.
I mean, we can pick up each of these. So there were a lot of points here, so let's just pick it up and then we can pick up such questions.
So on that specific point, spectrum is a public resource. It is being leased to a telecom operator for serving a public interest. Towards that end, whatever regulation has to come out has to be, and however telecom operators regulate access to the internet has to be in conformity with public interest, and that public interest could be fundamental rights, it would be non-discriminatory practices, etc., right? So if there wasn't exclusivity over spectrum, we would be having a very different debate. Airports are exclusive. One can argue that in public interest, there should be better regulation there. It doesn't mean that they should be unregulated. Does that answer your point?
And also, internet is kind of nowadays an essential service. It has not, so, a flight may not be an essentials thing. And you cannot actually compare it with the news, aspect, because here the telecom operators are being paid by me as a user. I am paying them, and they have peering charges, etc.
And on the news aspect, that's a very different discussion, simply because there is a select group of news service providers that is benefiting from the rent that is being paid to them, specifically by big tech. So if you look at the way it has been sliced, there is exclusivity all around. So, for example, the Google News initiative in India pays a certain set of publishers for showing their content on Google News. We don't get paid at MediaNama for this. Why? So I'm saying, should we get paid? I don't think so. Like, it's consumer choice. Should they get paid? I actually don't think so. For a very simple reason. News publishers, if they're saying that these platforms have taken traffic away from them, have always had the opportunity to use robust text to block access to their sites so that they become the exclusive source for that content. The problem is all news publishers, remember the Guardian was the first publisher to sign up for Meta's instant articles, right? At that point in time, I remember saying that they're feeding the beast. Because the Guardian, from a content creation perspective, like access to the Guardian would get consumed within Meta, within Facebook, in the same way that a lot of access to news today has been consumed by Google search. They have all got the option of using robots or text to prevent scraping or to prevent even access. They've chosen not to exercise it. They are benefiting from the traffic that is being sent to them, by Meta, by Google. What you're doing is, A, you want to benefit from the traffic coming to you. B, you also want to benefit from money being paid to you. The point is, like in Canada, if they decide to shut you off and not pay you, you're going to die because you'll get no traffic anyway. So this is a gambit that is being played, especially in an electoral year. Australia was an electoral year. Canada's coming to an elections. India's coming to an elections. This is just mainstream media trying to extract their pound of flesh from a government going into elections, no matter which country. That's just the way I see it. It's not related to this debate, but this is how I see it.
I'd like to take now, Sir's had a question.
So 2 points. One is, in certain cases, especially when we look at, let's say, JioFiber and some of these other plans, the data tariff already includes certain OTT subscriptions. Okay, so in that case, I am also paying for OTT, although to the telco. So in a way, the payment is going from the telco to the OTTs. I don't know what the arrangement is there, but presumably they are getting something. Okay, that's one. Second is, yes, as Amrita mentioned, so USO fund, which started in 2002, May, it's already gone to only 70,000 crores, which is, and the interesting thing, if you see their chart, as well as so it's a good thing, rarely we see in the government, that they update it every year. So the corpus has been actually increasing every year. Okay, so instead of decreasing. So they are collecting more money than they are dispersing every year. And I think except for 1 or 2 years when the disbursement was higher than the collection. So, and today it's around 70,000 crores rupees there. And of course, in the telecom bill, which came in September last year, the draft bill, it says that they're going to convert that into a telecom development fund, which will also fund R&D and other stuff. So today, at least, there's some specificity in terms of where it can be used. But in future, it can be used for other things also. But by the way, even today, it can be used not only to support the supply side infrastructure, which is what is being doing, but it can be used very well even to support the demand side. So for example, if you say that there's a gender gap, if you say that there are certain areas, certain communities, certain people with certain, let's say students or people with certain level of income, if the government wants to support them, you can provide them devices as well as support their tariffs to whatever extent that you want to do. And DBT platform can be very well used for that. The third thing is that in terms of, we have this chatbots today are very popular, as has been mentioned earlier also, across a whole lot of apps, so banking, e-commerce, even government for that matter. Government is also, whole lot of government services are also. So perhaps when this licensing framework comes, all of those will also require a telecom license, perhaps. And the last thing is, in terms of exclusivity that Nikhil had mentioned, I think I just want to clarify one thing. So as a telco, they have basically exclusivity to 4 different things. One is a type of services that can be offered under the scope of license. Second is how they can do it. So there are 3 components to that. One is in terms of the spectrum. So there's a certain type of spectrum which only a telco can bid. So even if it is auctioned, only if you have a license, you can bid for that. Second is the national numbering plan. So E.164 protocol of ITU. So the national numbering plan, only telcos have access, nobody else has access. And the third is the right of way. So that right of way does not exist with others. Thank you.
That's sir on the panel, I think. We should have had him on the panel. Yeah, so also please introduce yourselves, guys, if you...
I am Aditya Trivedi, an associate at Competition Advisory Services. So, being from the competition law background, I might just want to comment on the digital news media and the tussle with big tech.
Let's not talk about news media. We're talking about...
So let me ask a question with that regard, because like big tech, including Google and Meta, they shut down their news services in Australia. They threatened. In Canada, they might. And in Spain, actually, they did it in 2013. I might disagree with you that in an election year, news media publishers are making a demand because the CCI case is going on since 2022. And government has not done anything. We don't have any legislative remedy. We might wait for CCI. So unlike European Commission, Australia has relied more on competition laws. My question is, can big tech really dare to shut down their news platforms in a country like India?
I don't know, but there are a couple of things here. I think they can shut down whatever they want. They're private platforms.
But we are their biggest market.
So, I mean, you're answering us like they will use it. So how many of us consume news on social media in any case, right? When most of us do, maybe it'll be a nicer place without news.
that
Like who knows? Question. I mean, look, the thing is, they took a call to shut it down in Canada. They can do it here. I'd like to see them do it here. I'd like to see a government shut down a big tech platform in this country. Let them shut down Gmail. Let's see what happens. Let them shut down. Let them shut down WhatsApp. Let's see what happens.
And you also need to realize the government also uses these services. If it is an election year, they benefit more than what we do. Yes. So let's get hard facts. Who uses these platforms more than we do? And what hate speech moves that triggers people to do so many things? Though I don't buy that just because that message is moving through some platform, the platform is wrong. But where is these messages coming from? Look at the source. And what is it triggering? So we should not get into
It's not also just in exceptional cases, say on an election year or in certain cases. The government using WhatsApp as a mode of communication, of operation every day, even within citizens and within the government itself. If you take away WhatsApp and you start charging them, the government is going to be the biggest one that is going to suffer, right? Government departments are operating on WhatsApp groups and chats. So policy is being decided over there.
Let's get back to network fees.
I think, is there other questions which relate to the sort of issue on network fees? Maybe these are things which we can pick up, I think, in conversations afterwards as well, because there's a lot to unpack on those. But let's just quickly wrap up, I think, a few questions. So if I can see who all still want to ask questions. We got one here. Anyone else has a question?
Comment.
Okay, then cool. Then we can wrap up after this, yeah.
Hi, this is Shubham from the Quantum Hub. Although we all agree that there is no basis for having a network usage fee charged on OTT platforms, I am indeed curious in the line of questioning that Vakasha took, that how can you say, if in a imaginative state that TSPs want to have some revenue from OTTs and they want to set up a fund for having infrastructure development. When we took this exercise internally, we thought, why don't TSPs raise costs for their plans? Maybe there could be a tiered plan where, like, say, if you use more than 3 GBs per day, you pay higher. I just wanted to understand what are the price regulations that are placed on TSPs which may, say, disrupt their plan or, say, may cause them to not raise their pricing. Is there a price cap?
There is no price cap. It's competition. It's the market which decides it. And two, if you as a TSP just hypothetically raise the price, okay, for 3G, for 4G, how much of India is actually getting 4G?
And I don't think it's on a want basis, right? TSPs want to charge, want to take from an OTT is not a basis for, does not give them a right to take from them, right? They might want to do a lot of things.
I completely agree with that position. I just want to understand.
Pricing is up to the market.
So telecom operators are required to publish. So one, they have to do non-discriminatory pricing, which is they have to have pricing plans which are available to all consumers across the board. They have no restriction in terms of increasing or decreasing their prices in the market, which means that if they want to raise rates, and remember, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, Airtel, Idea, Vodafone, Airtel would announce on day 1, day 2, Vodafone and Idea would increase rates on the same day in the same amount that Airtel has raised. So the entire market's rates would go up at the same time. What, as we've been saying, it's now competition. Over the last year, Airtel had raised rates. What happened was Jio launched its new Jio phone and gave an annual pricing along with the phone, which basically brought average prices down again. So every time Airtel tries to raise rates, Jio brings it down. It's a competitive market. So there's nothing that prevents them. It's just that's the way Jio is playing this game.
So I think also I had a point.
Actually, TRA has the remit of regulating tariffs, and in '99 they had come out with tariff, so there was a standard plan which everybody had to offer, and then there were alternative plans which they could offer. And a few years later, they saw that there's sufficient competition in the market, and that's when they stopped this particular tariff regulation. So today, if TRA wants, if they want, and if they see that there's a need, they can always come out with the regulation, including floor, ceilings, anything for that matter. But today, the TRA has what is known in the regulatory realms as forbearance on tariff.
So the other thing that happened, if you want to take a look at it, about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, lost track of time, there was a TRAI consultation on pricing and tariffs. And I remember being at the open house discussion, and most telecom operators were arguing for the idea of personalizing tariffs. So they would, for the same service, they would charge you differently from how they would charge me. My submission at that point in time was that will actually lead to discriminatory pricing. That depending, so if you look at how Uber works, there is, Uber works on trying to identify what consumer surplus might be, which is how much more benefit do you get from getting a cab at that point in time, at that particular place, at that tariff, and then they optimize how much you are charged for it. So when demand is high, utility is you're likely to be willing to pay more for it because supply is low. So they look at consumer surplus on the supplier side, consumer surplus on the consumer side, and they optimize there. Consumer surplus can also be used from a discriminatory perspective, which is you create a situation where you reduce the amount of consumer surplus available, which means you increase prices to a level where you're still getting a benefit, but you're getting less benefit because service providers don't have the benefit of actually knowing how much you're willing to pay. Now with big data, determining pricing for an individual is actually possible over a period of time. So for example, if you are on an important call at 1 o'clock at night and your prepaid balance runs out and you have to recharge, there is a way of estimating that you'd be willing to pay more for it. If, let's say, in a particular area, a woman is stuck and wants to hire a cab while it's raining, and it's 10 o'clock at night and she needs to get home, in an area which is typically not considered safe for women, the pricing would be substantially higher because the consumer surplus moves up, right? So I'd actually argued against discriminatory pricing and standardization of tariffs, whereas all the telcos were arguing from enabling personalized pricing. So just on the pricing, how this works. There's a point. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on this.
If you can just introduce yourself.
I'm Avantika Tiwari. I work at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies as a fellow, and I'm also doing my PhD at JNU. So just a follow-up, you were saying that now most of the revenue that's generated is not actually coming from, say, the services that the telecom services are providing in terms of SMS and like calls, etc., but from data. So the scenario that you just presented, that the big data would be able to kind of predict and profile customers, isn't that already underway, or like?
It's already underway.
What are they doing with that data is what I'm trying to understand.
It's already underway. So if you go to a telecom operator network operating center, you will be able to see on really large screens at what time of day which service is being accessed in which part of the country in terms of bandwidth consumption. So they have very granular data on every single individual's access of services. And so they have the ability. They don't have the regulatory permission. That's it.
All services have that.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
OTTs also have, as in everyone who's giving us service and the mobile which we are using, even the manufacturer of that phone has all that. So
Use VPNs. Before they're banned.
Okay, so I think we've got no more questions or comments, which means we can wrap up. Thank you guys for this. I think one last thought for us to think is that, okay, government wants this because they want decryption. The platforms, the telcos want it because they want money. So, which means I think, anyone who understands that this is a sort of power and money grab should definitely try to be involved with this conversation as much as possible, because traditional parties to this are not going to want to do anything. And I guess the question is if, and this was a question which I was briefly thinking.
Actually, there's one question which I feel remains unanswered, which we haven't considered, and I think someone mentioned it. Amrita and Rahul both had mentioned about bandwidth consumption. Why is it that in this consultation paper, communication services are being singled out for this purpose, whereas if you look at bandwidth consumption, video consumes the most amount of bandwidth in a network.
Yeah, absolutely.
That comes, look at the telecom paper, Nikhil, and that's what we were saying. It is the encrypted platform and others where they want the, who's sending the information.
This is just a byproduct.
This is just a byproduct. This is just the, I would say, camouflaging what the actual intent is. I may be wrong, but I think I'm right.
Actual intent will get covered in the next session, which is about breaking encryption.
Which is essentially there, right?
Because this is essentially how
we saw the next panel already.
And what we would request is please make your submissions to TRAI. Let it not be just the telcos and a few people who are making, because it's important. Everything is being discussed. Handshake between different businesses would happen. Payments would go, and at the end, the customers would suffer.
So if you need help in submissions, we will be publishing our submissions. Please feel free to copy paste into ChatGPT and ask it to rewrite it if you agree with us.
Or you can look at it and make your own submissions, but do make your own submissions.
Or even generate a counterpoint. I'm just making things easier.
Nikhil, just on your point about OTT communication services and why not, that's exactly the point I was trying to make earlier as well. The conversation in the rest of the world has got nothing to do with one type of service. It's not about communication. There's no one asking in the EU for only a Google or a Meta to pay. Netflix is very much part of that conversation, right? It's about the number of traffic. And that's also an imperfect solution. It's not to say that traffic should be the method by which you determine whether this is, is how it's going to play out.
But at least there's some concept there.
Yeah, but at least it's
the
like a
Korean
concept
one was called Netflix discussion.
To that point, let's not forget that this entire conversation began with Netflix versus Comcast, where Comcast tried to extract revenue from Netflix and essentially suppress traffic and speeds for Netflix. So the net neutrality debate started with Netflix versus Comcast, as far as I know.
And Europe
unless you can correct me on this.
And Europe itself in 2012 has already rejected this entire notion, right? And now it's come back into the fray there again. There has been conversation around in 2012 when you had a proposal being made for a sender pays type network fees, which was rejected on these same grounds, and which governments have continued to talk about on the net neutrality implications of it. And I think that's something that we're now just seeing a re-agitation of the same issues, whether it's there or here.
Great. I think we'll move on to the next panel. Thanks, Amrita. Thanks, Rahul. Thanks, Prakasha. I'm going to stay on and now take the other side and play devil's advocate and moderate the next panel. I'd like to invite Neeti Bayani from ISOC, Aman Taneja from Ikigai, and Sumesh Srivastava from the Quantum Hub. Hi. So this is where we're going to discuss national security for the most bit. and licensing, encryption, access to our messaging services, and looking at the licensing framework for online services. So I'm going to start with a quick fire round of sorts about definition of messaging. So if you could raise your hands, and everyone in the room also, is this a messaging service or not? Instagram? Messaging? Okay. Twitter? Messaging? Okay. Facebook Messenger? Messaging? There are people who disagree that Facebook Messenger is messaging. Gaming app as well. Okay. Google Meet. Zoom. Messaging. Signal. Chat in Clash of Clans. Messaging. Okay. WeChat. Come on, raise your hands. I don't see anyone. Like, what's the point of doing this exercise? Paytm, messaging? Okay. Gosh, I can't. So, there doesn't seem to be consensus on what is a messaging app. I'll start with you, Neeti. How do you define messaging, and what is a messaging app?
I think we've had some discussion on this in the first session, right?
Yeah.
There are differing opinions on whether we need bright lines, whether we need common sense approach, whether whatever we do need. I don't think we're ever going to come to consensus on what is a messaging app and what isn't. Like, even on the most obvious choices. Facebook Messenger, someone said it's used for gaming. So we cannot, while trying to define an app and its primary service, ignore the fact that there is multifunctionality. There is a very wide range of services offered on the same platforms, on the same services, and there can be no sort of like cookie cutter approach to this in defining what a messaging service is and what isn't. Like, even WhatsApp, which is most commonly used in the country, is also doubling up now as a payment service with WhatsApp payments.
So what's the criteria?
So I don't think there is any cookie cutter approach. I don't think, I am very against such a differentiation.
So like I asked in the first session, the TRAI report talks about intelligent differentia. Do any of you see intelligent differentia in what's messaging and what's not messaging? And I'm going to go back there and ask questions from there now so I can involve everyone. Hi, guys, could you please take your seats? We are in the middle of a panel. Would any of you like to join the panel? So, sorry, I can be a bully sometimes, but intelligent differentia in messaging. If you had to respond to the TRAI consultation paper on intelligent differentia, what would you say? Sumesh?
So I primarily agree with Neeti here that in terms of defining messaging apps is very difficult because all of them have different features. But if you were to, if I were to make an argument on this, I would say like primarily if your function is to do messaging, then I think that would at least make sense to me if you want to categorize messaging apps in that manner.
Define primarily.
So if, for example, if the messaging part is incidental to your core service, for example...
WhatsApp has 600 million internet users in this country.
Yeah.
They have, let's say, right now 2 million, I don't even know, 2 million UPI users for mobile payments. Yeah. Let's say they hit 601 million mobile payments users. What are they?
No, so which is why that's the problem, right? The internet is dynamic in its nature, which is why it's probably not a good idea to fit in any OTT apps within any frameworks because they might change. That's the point, that they can change what they're offering to people based on what users want or what the market wants.
Can I also add to that, saying that you only ask for intelligible differentia when there is manifest arbitrariness. What arbitrariness are we trying to address here? There is a reason that telecom, and if like that's where we're going, the telecom and online services, first of all, OTT is a misnomer. I think Amrita already talked about it. I also want to ask, on top of what? Like, telecom companies are not sole proprietors of the internet. It is a network of networks. They don't own the internet.
They're just the edge service providers.
Absolutely. They own part of that network, but essentially the internet is 75,000, over 75,000 network of networks that are autonomous, independent, and choose to connect with one another. So if I have a network today, I have a role to play in the internet, and my network is not owned by a TSP. So first, on top of what, right? Second, what is this arbitrariness? Because I feel like on a regulatory footing, we're already governed by the Department of Telecommunications, and internet-based services are already governed under MeitY and MIB. So what is the arbitrary failure that we're trying to address here?
Nikhil, if I could come. Actually, I had a specific question for you related to this. There is an idea that we will not regulate those entities in this framework for whom messaging is an incidental function. Have we seen this kind of an approach in regulation anywhere? And how does this work? How do you address this vagueness? Is the word incidental defined in law? Yeah, I'm asking you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Nikhil. No, I think that's precisely the language that actually the EECC also uses, right? Incidental service.
EECC?
The European Communication Code. They use that language, but and I think one of the examples they give is of within a gaming platform, what is incidental, right? But I think the challenge will always remain that you may have designed a service for one purpose, but then because you end up using that as a communication service because it's easier, it's where you're not subject to the same amount of regulation, etc. It'll be so dynamic. How do you keep track of what is an incidental feature to a service, and what is the core functionality? Also, for services that you've been describing, that there could be multiple functions that are embedded, right? And one is not in derogation to the other. For instance, it could be like the super app, the WeChat example that you gave. It's all of those functions. So what is incidental and what is not will remain a challenge. But I do want to add to the point being made earlier that, I mean, really the question we should be asking is, why are we asking this question? What is the regulatory intent behind asking for separate regulation? Point already made that regulations already exist. But if the question is on substitutability, now that's a notion also that we need to address, because are the services that we get on these OTT communication platforms substitutable or substitutes for traditional voice messages?
Messaging is a substitute for email.
Precisely. Like that. I mean, do you want to include email in this or not?
I'm asking.
I don't see it happening.
Messaging is not incidental to email. It is messaging.
It is messaging, right? No, and also the point being, and as a substitute, like there's so many additional features that you get on OTT, right? It's not just messaging, it's messaging plus, like you can share screens, you can collaborate on documents. There's so much more that offers. So is it really a substitute at all if you're making that substitutability argument?
No, so if there had to be intelligence differentia in what is a messaging service, what would it look like? What would you say? So let's take it in now, right? Yeah. IT rules 2021 define what is a social media. They say they define social media and say it doesn't include those for whom the social media aspect is a incidental activity, right? Yeah. I think they do that, right? Primarily and solely,
but also
right?
It says, I mean, the social media is something which allows two or more users to interact. What on the internet does not allow you to interact? I mean,
Agreed.
The nature of the internet.
But then to that extent, they have even defined a threshold of a really large threshold of 5 million users, which covers 90% of the apps that are operating in India with 891 million users. So then what is the intelligent differentia in determining what is regulated as a social media app in this country? From the government, like where have they created that distinction? So for example, if Twitter is regulated as an SSMI,
sure. So
where do I have evidence that Paytm should not be regulated as an SSMI because it fits the definition?
No, fair enough. I think, I mean, with the social media definition, essentially what they're trying to do is there's at least a little bit more clarity on the regulatory intent there, right? Essentially, they're trying to deal with the issue of virality and the spread of information at rapid rates and therefore heighten standards and thresholds. At least that is something you can decipher.
No, but here there's a very clear regulatory intent to create, let's say, law enforcement access in messaging apps.
So, I mean, then the question becomes, is that not already there? Messaging apps are also one of the many internet services which are regulated by the IT Act already. There are provisions for law enforcement access already there. So again, the question is, why are we creating this distinction when general regulations do govern this space?
So if I may come in here, the only sort of services where law enforcement doesn't have access are end-to-end encrypted systems, right? That is what they want access to. It's as simple as that.
But that doesn't seem to be the regulatory intent of this paper, is it? So it's essentially looking to create, and the IT and the telecom bill might also do that. The last telecom bill did that. Create a regulatory framework for what they call OTT communication services, what we call online messaging services, messaging and calling services. So then should those, like, what is the rationale behind defining something as one? Because that definition is going to be then a bone of contention and clearly a situation of vagueness, which is going to lead to many players basically not sure about which side of the regulatory where do they stand?
I think there are already quite a few categories, as you know, you already talked about social media and significant social media intermediaries. With the whole new gaming intermediaries regulations, now there's a section called gaming intermediaries, and this consultation paper very interestingly creates an OTT communication service category on its own, like before it's even received feedback from stakeholders and actors such as ourselves. But apparently now we'll have OTT communication services also. So of course there's going to be regulatory overlap, of course there's going to be judicial overlap, there's going to be a lot of confusion in really like defining who are you after. If the intent here is to be able to have law enforcement access for end-to-end encrypted messaging services, let's just put it down on paper. It's a very roundabout way of saying, oh, like, you know, we need to know who's saying what.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in here in terms of the definitions as well. Because if you look at the telecom bill, and usually we've seen the practice in other jurisdictions, is that definitions in such legislations are prescriptive. As in, if you fall under certain conditions, that's how you know you have certainty. But the definitions that we've had in the draft telecom bill, they are descriptive, right? Like they cover everything. So I feel like the intent of the government, it does come from trying to break encryption, does come from a concern about national security. Because even, recently the minister also talked about how surveillance is something which would be dealt with under the telecom bill, right? Like I think on a conversation with DPTP. So I think the intent is clearly very clear where they are worried about the national security consequences. But I don't understand why they want to regulate internet services under the telecom bill when you might as well just do it under different legislations. You can put it under DIA, you can put it under even the IT rules and all. That is what is very confusing actually.
So two questions related to that. First is when you look at the same service, same rules argument from the telecom operators, right? They're saying that SMS and messaging is, SMS and calling on the regular calling and messaging has law enforcement access as quality of service requirement. Let's leave the quality of services thing aside for now and just say there's law enforcement access there. Every node has like something called, like every circle has a centralized monitoring system that the law enforcement agencies and security agencies can access to, let's say, tap anyone's phone. There are 300 orders being issued every day for tapping phones. all of that communications has moved to online services, including WhatsApp. We were at a TRAI discussion in 2019 where in the room there were like 4 people who were retired armed forces personnel, and they made the argument that when we're in Kashmir and there is a bus with our soldiers goes around the corner, there is encrypted communications, there is a blast, and my soldiers die. Whereas if it was going over SMS or calling like it used to, I would be able to prevent this from happening. We are now blind. And this happened in that TRAI consultation. And it's a very difficult question to answer. You might face, if you go for the TRAI consultation this time, you might face the same question. How would you respond to that? Why should there be the same requirements that were on SMS and calling? Why shouldn't the same requirements for law enforcement access be available on WhatsApp, on Signal, on Telegram, on Threema, on 14, 15, 20 different apps?
So I think the practical answer for that would be that due to the nature of how the internet works, if you do impose these on, let's say, the existing OTT communication players, there will be other players which will come up. Like we've seen this across the world. You cannot control the internet, and we've seen it happening in the Russia-Ukraine thing as well, where people do sort of find a way to get messages out, right? So I think, and this is something that we've seen the government keep talking about, how they want to control user harms, control flow of information on the internet, trying to do it through different legislations. But I think this just shows a fundamental lack of understanding of the nature of the internet, right? Like you can't really control it in the way that they're thinking of doing.
But not being able to control isn't a reason for not trying to control, right?
Yeah, I know. I'm saying, the intent is there to try to control it, but because of the difference in the nature of how a TSP network works and how a OTT communication app works, you cannot try to impose the same rules on both.
So then in that case, you can bring exclusivity. So TSPs are easier to control because there are fewer TSPs.
Yeah.
They have exclusivity. This time linked to spectrum and licensing. And so therefore you can regulate it through a regulatory mechanism. Why can't you impose the same thing on online services? There's no spectrum, but you say only these services can operate in the country because they have to get a registration done. And therefore, because they're only registered players can operate, we will impose the same regulations on them. Why, in the interest of national security, why can't the government do that?
The government can, but my point then would be that the bad actors will just move into unregulated platforms. And you're just cutting off the market for people who just want to use these platforms for other purposes. That would be the consequence of that.
Aman, Neeti, okay, go ahead.
I kind of want to agree with that because I feel like end-to-end encryption, which is the problem here, end-to-end encryption, which is the problem here, is a technology. Now that technology is available very widely. And because of the commodification of end-to-end encryption, now you can be sitting in high school and create an application or a platform which offers end-to-end encryption. So you can block, ban, license, regulate WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, whatever offers end-to-end encryption. Can you stop people from using the technology? It's out there. It's the same argument that we've seen even with weapons of mass destruction. The technology is out there. Can you stop that? Can you stop someone making a weapon of mass destruction? NPT or no NPT?
Yeah, and just adding to that, right? Also, what is, I mean, then are you, one, arguing for a world without end-to-end encryption at all, ignoring the other benefits that it has, right? There's so many situations where you want encrypted communication. Are you saying that should not be allowed? How do you, again, control sort of the use of the technology? Oh, sorry. Sorry, just lost my train of thought there.
How would proportionality play into this?
Exactly. So that's the other question that I mean, there are two competing interests that you're looking at, right? Like the ability to communicate safely, the ability to communicate potentially anonymously. Is there a right to anonymous communication in this country or not? I would argue yes, that you should be able to communicate anonymously without being identified at every level, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you're communicating through I mean, whatever way you access the internet, there is a level of KYC which happens there. So at every level above that, also should you be monitored and, you know, not have that ability to communicate in that manner. It has to be balanced with your concerns about national security, and that's really the question.
So in its submission,
Nikhil, sorry,
yes.
just before you go on to your next question, I also want to add, I don't think any of us are saying that we should not think about national security. I don't think we're at all saying that there should be no law and order. In fact, end-to-end encryption, what it offers to us is the ability, the digital equivalent of having a conversation in a closed room or on a mountaintop where no one can listen to us. Do we have that privilege? Because we're not subjects, we're citizens. Do we have that privilege? So end-to-end encryption is not a law enforcement issue alone. It is a technology that helps keep a lot of people extremely safe, including children, the elderly, women, marginalized populations. You know, so when you talk about proportionality, like I want to approach this issue beginning from there. Are we not willing to take into account the concerns that the most downtrodden, underprivileged, marginalized people in our country do have? So do they have that right to be a citizen, not a subject?
Sumesh? It's on. It's on, it's on.
Because you mentioned proportionality. So I think using national security as the ground is actually a very strategic way to go about it as well, right? From the government's perspective, because we've seen it.
I can tell you, in that room, in 2019, we struggled. Because 4 people sitting in the row, like Apar and I were sitting together in the row in front of us, there were 4 retired army generals, right? Across the room, there were a couple of retired police officials, all asking for the same thing.
But we've also seen, for example, if you remember in the Anuradha Basan case and the subsequent case, internet shutdowns case, we've seen the court put down tests of proportionality, say a lot of nice things, but when it finally comes to it, they always cave in. I remember Gautam Bhatia had called it evasion by abrogation or something in the... So I think using national security as a ground, like we can talk about how it doesn't make sense, how it might not pass proportionality in our tests, but we've seen that practically when it does go to court, the court does tend to fold in.
In the Pegasus case, Justice Ramanna, in the Pegasus case, kept, like, must have, I was like transcribing that, he must have said it almost 6 to 7 times. We don't want to go into issues of national security. It's a silver bullet, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So how do you counter that argument?
I think from our side, we should be countering that if you're breaking encryption, you're also sort of encouraging more and more bad actors. You are creating more and more risks for people who are on the internet. Might not work from the point of view of national security, but you're not really helping to create a safer internet experience for people.
So just as a reminder, in 2015, in Reliance Jio's submission on the net neutrality issue, what they asked for, their first paragraph said that Jio supports net neutrality. After that, everything that they said was basically enabling surveillance and violating net neutrality. A great first sentence. All media publications carried it on that Jio supports net neutrality. No one read the document. I did. And Jio asked for a couple of things. They asked for all hosting to be services to store data in India. They asked that all messaging applications and calling applications need to set up lawful interception. There should be verification and authentication of all users. There should be continuous monitoring of messages. Decryption keys should be given to the government. All call data records should be recorded. We're having the same discussion that we had in 2015 right now. And we are going to have the same discussion at the TRAI, right? Let's talk about verification and authentication of users. And I remember Vineet going on multiple TV debates with me, which talk about how there needs to be Aadhaar authentication for WhatsApp users. What's your take on that? Like, if there is a need for traceability in the IT rules, if there is a push for national security, what's the argument against verifying users of messaging? If people are verified for phone calling, what's the harm in getting them verified for messaging? Biometric authentication for messaging. Aman?
Sure. I mean, fundamental question is again the why, right? Like if I am being, at the level at which I access the internet, you already have sufficient information about me. You have full details about who I am, you have my photograph, etc. That's already with you. Do you really require me for every service that I use? And also then it comes back to that question of where does messaging begin and end, right? Like, I mean, all of these questions are connected, but then does that mean for every service that I want to use, I will have to provide, pretty much do a KYC, right? One, do I want everybody that I interact with in all the services that I want to do? From a privacy perspective, do I want all of them to have all this information about me? Is there really a need also? I mean, I'm actually solving a regulatory need that is not being solved at present through identification at the access layer already. I don't know if I have clarity on that answer as yet, and I mean, happy to hear from what others here think. And of course, there's massive friction for any business to have to do this KYC. And I mean, you do it in certain situations, yes, at higher risk levels, but is everyday communication where you'd want to put that in, really?
Okay, is there a proportionality in verification?
There must be, right?
Okay.
So I just want to come in here. So I think generally for verification, it's very important that we need to start pushing back a bit. I don't know if anyone saw that, but on Twitter, I came across this tweet of someone having to sign up for a co-working space and being required to give their Aadhaar,
Correct.
right? So
WeChat said that Aadhaar authentication is the easiest, most reliable method that they have, and they give DigiLocker as an option. In fact, Ashwini Vaishnav said that because children need parental permission, they can use DigiLocker to get parental permission for using. So what's wrong with using DigiLocker for using WhatsApp?
So, I mean, I don't want to give my analysis on that specific question, but I think generally...
No, I'm asking.
Whether using DigiLocker for WhatsApp makes sense or not, because I think WhatsApp, you already need a phone number to use WhatsApp, right? So your KYC, whether perfect or imperfect, like I saw your GIF with the washing machine today, but SIM card KYC...
No, that was a reference to money laundering.
Okay.
That's why there was a washing machine, sorry.
But yeah, so there is already a level of KYC. Now, in fact, I actually want to ask you, so there was this that verification event that MediaNama had done where Varun had shared a model of proportional verification based on the purpose for which you need the verification. So I think that model made sense. There might be certain messaging applications or certain internet applications where there is a case for a certain level of verification and authentication, but imposing it on, let's say, all messaging apps, you're increasing the cost of compliance. You're making it difficult for me to switch between apps as a user. So I'm not saying that totally verification should not be there. There might be cases where it's justified, but you cannot impose it everywhere and then just force everyone to share their Aadhaar for each and everything.
Neeti?
So I think Aadhaar to begin with is a monster on its own. I mean, there have been various scholars who've been talking for like over a decade now about the problems it has, right? So over collection of data, over mining of data, who owns this data, how secure is it? Is the DPDP going to enable any sort of security at all? Big questions. And then you're saying that you essentially want what are non-Indian apps to be collecting biometric data on your citizenry. So from an internet architecture perspective, data should be stored where it most makes sense.
So let's take data storage out of the game. Let's say all you'll get is an authentication indicating is this person who she says she is. That's all you'll get. The authentication will be done using Aadhaar KYC.
Yeah, but like why? Why should I not be allowed to communicate anonymously? Like what if there are instances where people do need to communicate anonymously? There are enough instances of communities and support groups where in fact your anonymity has often protected you, right? So to counter one harm, you are actually enabling other harms.
Okay.
Agreed. That's the point I was making earlier also, that there should be a right to anonymous communication, and I think there is a right to anonymous communication in this country.
Okay. Questions, comments? Uttara, is Snap a messaging service or a publisher?
Yes, yes.
Is it a messaging service?
We're both. Of course, we're a messaging service, so you are able to do person-to-person communication on Snap, but you're also able to view content from publishers or from users.
So is there an
kind of like
intelligent differential between whether it's a messaging service or a publishing service?
How do you mean intelligible?
It's a TRI asking, not me.
Yeah, look, so that's the thing. I think from our perspective, it's a messaging app and it also offers other sorts of functionalities. In fact, actually, we started out as being just a messaging app, but now we've sort of met, and I'm sure a lot of people stopped using Snapchat in 2018, and apologies to them for the lack of context, but the app redesigned, right? And the form it currently has actually is that one part of the app allows you to message a friend, another part of the app allows you to consume content from publishers, and yet another tab on the app allows you to consume content from other users. So make of that what you will, right? It's a bit of a super app, but not really. I don't know. Yeah. So it's not quite, it doesn't quite fit very neatly into TRI's conceptions of
Would you want to Aadhaar authenticate your users?
That would be not an option at the moment. I mean, we're obviously watching all developments very closely, but overall, no. I think in terms of ID-based verification, I don't think that's something that's a live consideration that we would embrace without examining for all sorts of impacts on our users, etc.
If there were law enforcement requirements for you to Aadhaar, if there was a
well, at the moment there
regulation, if the telecom bill required you to register for a license and authenticate users?
At the moment, in the current regulatory regime, there isn't a KYC requirement, right? And in our submissions, in our conversations with government, we have talked about the various risks associated with collecting that much data, right? I mean, yesterday, the minister said that the mainstay of the data protection bill was data minimization, right? So if another type of regulation is requiring an OTT to collect, we have about 200 million users in India, 200 million people's Aadhaar.
So you're a significant social media intermediary?
Absolutely. We've been for a long time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that
huh.
it? Oh. No.
Go on. You were saying something.
No, I was saying that essentially, if we were required to collect the Aadhaar of 200 million users, that is not very data minimal at all, right? So from my perspective, we would obviously, in good faith and engaging with all the types of stakeholders, including in this room, try and make a plea for the fact that there are many reasons not to go ahead with KYC for OTT communication services. So, yeah.
Okay. Anyone questions, comments? Rohit, I'll just come.
I actually just wanted to respond to what you were saying about the very serious national security sort of pushback that you get in TRI consultations, right? I think the example of a 2019 post, you're suddenly in this vacuum of information where that's sort of leading to these terrorist attacks, right? You go back to pre-2019 when we were on telephone and SMS and when that was fully regulated, you had the same incidences happening. The real question on national security and those sort of things is about capacity as well, right? What is the capacity building that is happening within national enforcement agencies? How is that working out? What is the use of technology over there within, whether it's law enforcement at a local level or the army? Those are sort of questions that get hidden away when we just sort of, you can't talk about national security, right? So I think there is a conversation that is there to sort of push back on that, to say that, okay, let's look at national security very, very seriously and look at what are the capacities we've been building. And you can't simply just use national security as a way to get access to information. You want to have the ability to access information. But there are other ways you can also sort of, address those concerns. And there somehow doesn't seem to be a lot of conversation there, right? You just come out and say that, oh, now I can't have access to this, so I can't predict a bomb blast. Well, you couldn't predict a bomb blast when it was happening, when you had access to it. So what changes with you getting access? Like, I don't see how that is purely a direct sort of, the relationship over there is kind of faulty.
I had one tricky question that I don't have an answer to. So, do you want to go first, then Rohit?
I think just responding on that national security point of view,
I have heard so much about this open house discussion where this happened. But I have also been in meetings with, people who work in national security where they've actually said that they don't like this idea that other apps come and everybody moves off WhatsApp because they have, like, for example, there is some kind of an arrangement that has been working pretty okay with the government in the sense that
What kind
Section
of an
69,
arrangement?
I mean, whatever, like under the IT rules, it's an established company. They have people here.
Hotline.
They are coordinating. I don't know what that is. But in the sense, the point is that they also don't want, I mean, I also think that national security itself is not a monolith. There are different voices within national security establishment as well who may not want and who are very aware of the fact that internet, I mean, they've also been watching how internet works and they are aware of the fact that, there are different apps that are being, you can make new apps and internet is hard to control. So I was just making that point.
GeoChat.
Yes, exactly. So I was just making this point that, even national security, we should not take it as a monolith. And I do think that in the last meeting, there was a comment made that actually they are trying to intercept and that is why they are getting into licensing. I think it's the other way around. National security is hard to push back against because, you don't want to be seen as somebody who doesn't care about that. But it's actually profit seeking and, trying to make that kind of money because there's a lot of pressure on telecom players, not just in terms of competition, but also from government's own Digital India push, right? So there is that kind of understanding that you need to get internet to a lot of people. So I also think that we need to be a little bit more aware of the politics of this and who's asking for what.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just actually building on that only and what Sumesh
Mic
had
up.
also said, just building on that, I think whenever the conversation around encryption happens, we start, oftentimes it goes into, end-to-end encryption cannot be broken. And, so therefore there is no solution. So let's say hypothetically, you could break encryption and then the law could require companies to give that information. What Sumesh was saying and what Prajita is saying, the first thing that will happen is that the bad actors will move into the unregulated space. The internet you cannot control. So you might tell the Play Stores that you won't allow, like for instance, in the online gaming space, the same argument is being put that, the SRBs are being created that will certify certain companies as legitimate and only those companies can advertise, send links through Play Store, etc.
I think, Rohit, you missed the first session. I made the point there about XMPP as a messaging protocol, Jabber, essentially, which allows, today I can go to GitHub, use an XMPP code, and basically create a messaging app.
Exactly.
So the actors that don't want to be tracked will just you can't ban a protocol. The actors will just create their own app and use that.
And then you will not even have key people to call upon. Like for instance, at least in the IT rules, the big established platforms, you have some people and some metadata at least can be shared, which at least can help you find out, for instance, in some of the group
conversations. But there's a counter to that particular point about metadata.
Right.
Signal has no metadata.
I agree.
Signal does not, for example, if Signal isn't being asked to comply with the IT rules, by the way. They have no information on Signal. So it looks like just WhatsApp is being targeted.
So exactly, and that's the whole point, right? So basically, no matter what you require in the law, you will not be able to solve the problem by asking companies to break encryption and give access to law enforcement. The real bad actors will find a way. So then why put this burden on the whole ecosystem? And as Prajita said, is this argument being used to drive another agenda because national security is hard to argue against?
Can I also come in here, Nikhil?
Yeah.
I also want to sort of interrogate this line of thinking that our national security is essentially based on breaking encryption. So we have a successful national security strategy if we're able to break encryption. And if we're not, then we're forever going to be vulnerable. Like that sort of approach to national security is full of holes. It is full of holes. And the next time I think any of us are in a room where, there are actors from that space, genuinely, let's ask them. So your entire strategy depends on breaking encryption.
I think the entire strategy revolves around building something like a centralized monitoring system. So all of our calls, all of our SMSs for those who still use regular calls and regular messages, can be tracked on a live, real-time basis by basically systems that are set up within telecom operator units in each circle linked to a mobile number. So basically, every call is going to can be recorded and replayed, and etc. etc. So that tracking mechanism, so it's a surveillance system which exists today. In fact, the centralized monitoring system, I remember I was on a Google Hangout with Milind Deora, who was the IT Minister of State at that point in time, and I asked him about it. And he said, the centralized monitoring system is great because now the telecom operators can't do it directly. The government will do it directly without the telecom operator even knowing. So earlier they had to take a lawful interception order to a telecom operator and they had to enable the resources. With the CMS, they put their system in the telecom network. So they can access it without the telco even knowing. So the idea is to enable that framework for messaging services like WhatsApp.
That sounds great, by the way.
Questions, comments?
So I don't have a solution for this, but I was just wondering if you're going to ask about, so I remember you had mentioned like a service like FireChat, which is not dependent on the internet, doesn't use network resources. So how would that work in this
I was going to ask that
frame?
question.
That's why
You're asking me the question. I don't have an answer.
That's why I asked you.
Has anyone here used FireChat? Okay, the two of us then. No. FireChat is a P2P messaging app which was used during the umbrella protests in Hong Kong. And they essentially came to India, tied up with this music festival called the NH7 Weekender. And that's where I used it. Like, basically, people, because there's like 20,000 people at a music festival, no network can basically support that kind of demand on the base stations. So nothing on the internet works. So people basically use P2P messaging over Bluetooth, which hops over from person to person to person in the entire network. Also used for protests. And I believe it was tried in Kashmir as well at the time of internet shutdowns. Which one was? Briar. Briar was, so also P2P messaging? Delhi during CEA protests. Okay. So any thoughts on what kind of a regulatory framework on OTT communication services will address P2P messaging applications?
You're not using the internet there. You're not using
Mic's off.
I mean, for the purposes of that app, you're not using the internet, right? Like it's P2P, so I think it would automatically kind of get out of the framework that they're envisaging right now, at least.
Okay, so then therefore the first session is going to apply, which is banning of apps. Fair enough. Comments, questions? Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to come back to the question on why can't OTT apps cater to lawful interception and have that. So if you read the telecom agreement, it basically says that in decryption module or that system has to be installed within the network itself. Now, if you go to UL VNOs, which technically lease network from TSPs, there the licensing condition, the catering to lawful interception and having that system within your network is conditioned to having that system in place. So if you don't have that system, you technically, by the terms of license, don't have to do that. So the system of...
Which system?
Basically, catering to lawful interception.
Lawful, yeah.
Right. So that is conditioned to the availability of that system. Now, if you imagine it in the OTT space, OTT apps essentially don't have a control over the telecom network, right? It's public internet that a user is, say, I buy an internet plan from Airtel and I install a WhatsApp. So in this entire ecosystem, WhatsApp is not, let's say, having a control over my Airtel internet. And the messages that I send are essentially going on as data packets, which is encrypted. So in this entire ecosystem where WhatsApp does not control internet, is it fair to say assume a telecom like lawful interception would be catered by WhatsApp when the underlying technology is different?
I didn't get that actually.
So the
So look, the entire requirement of a licensing framework is to enable access to the messaging.
Right.
They don't care about internet access. They care about being able to access the messaging for lawful interception.
Right. But in the telecom ecosystem, how it's done is that you have it in your network. One argument that is even in the VNO, like when in the VNO consultations, the argument that VNOs were giving that the lawful interception condition should not be binding was that we don't control the core network infrastructure, and since that technology is essentially coming from the TSPs that we lease the network from, let the TSPs do that and not like burden VNOs with that that condition.
The interception part, which is there in the telecom regulation, was more to do with the voice and the message SMS which was flowing through the network. Now, if a WhatsApp is using the bandwidth or the pipe, it is going through a WhatsApp channel through the pipe. So obviously a telecom operator is not supposed to dip into WhatsApp to find which packet is going to whom. And even today, when for security purposes, etc., law enforcement agencies go to the service providers, and here I mean the OTT providers, they do provide the amount of information they can. The only thing which WhatsApp or some of the encrypted platforms are not allowing is to actually give who is the message of who is first sending it to whom. To whom but who is first sending it. They're not allowing the intrusion into the network. They're giving the metadata. So it's not as if data is not being given. Data is being given, but law enforcement wants more.
Why focus on WhatsApp? Let's look at Signal. Signal is giving no data.
No, I'm saying that even today, it's a misnomer if people say that companies are not, I would say legitimate companies are not, helping law enforcement in their, investigations. And that comes to what, he was raising, which is very important, building the capacity of law enforcement and also, training them on how different other alternative technologies can be used to address investigative issues rather than just getting data. Today, it's become very easy that you get all the data, analyze it. But investigation is much more than just getting data. And internet and these services have actually helped them in their investigations because they get more information, more data than what they would traditionally get.
Right. In fact, the approach that Signal is taking is to collect no data, so they have no data to give. So if you don't collect the data, you can't be asked to give the data.
Hi, just a follow-up question. Imagine, and I agree with what you're saying, that it's a fractured discourse, right, at its constitutive formulation, which is that the more data we have, the more national security is ensured. But be that as it may, even if they have all the data that they want, they'd probably want somebody to glean that data, to classify that data further, and it's not unheard of that the Pegasus was also done by a private mercenary hired by the Israeli state. So there are those kind of partnerships also. So the state can at any point...
Israeli state? No, Indian state.
No, Israeli, because that's the source of origin. The Pegasus is not something that originated from here, right?
No. So the allegation,
Yeah.
and it's provable to some extent, is that the Indian state hired an Israeli company to infiltrate the phones of certain individuals.
Yeah.
So Israel issued a license?
Yeah.
An export license towards that effect.
And IDF has its own private mercenaries. So it's not like IDF as such can be charged or like the Israeli state can be charged because it's a private mercenary which kind of gleans the data of the state. So I'm saying tomorrow you have all the information that you have, yet you all of us know that the government does not really have the capacity to glean that data and classify it.
Mike.
And therefore, you might need private players to enter and go through that data, which is happening in the case of Aadhaar, right, or the UIDA. That there is a PPP model. So is it fair for all our information to actually go into the hands of private players in the name of national security is also something that we might want to ponder on.
No, my response to that was that effect is that Aadhaar doesn't necessarily transfer data. You can also get a yes or no answer for them, that is this person who they say they are, and therefore that identifier can be linked to that individual. So it's not necessarily transfer of data.
I want to come in here on just a very minor point because we've been talking about national security and encryption. So just there was just a one line in the Anuradha Basan case where the Supreme Court talked about the fact that, and this also comes from the point Amrita was making about building capacity, that just because the state does not have the capacity to identify the source of the content and catch the perpetrators does not mean that that gives them a free rein to restrict other fundamental rights. So even though this was not action maybe in the judgment or its implementation, this is a principle that does exist, that if you're saying that it's too difficult for you to catch bad actors or stop these activities, that does not mean that gives the state the right to over-regulate or even block content or apps or bans on this ground.
Let's talk about the data protection bill then. It does give that right, no? It gives that exception to the state.
They also use national security.
They also
I
use
think.
national
Makes
security.
sense, like we discussed.
So that it's sort of it counters your point, right?
No.
The data protection bill gives them that access.
It's not my point, it's the Supreme Court's point, but like I said, it wasn't actually action, but this is a principle, like this is something that exists, that just because the state is saying that we do not have the capacity to do that does not mean that gives them a right to then infringe on. And I think 37 DPDP that you're referring to, I do think it should be challenged on these grounds as well. It's not proportional at all. It doesn't balance, it doesn't explain the necessity. So I think that's going to be a problem as well.
But like the confluence of DIA, telecom bill and data protection bill, it creates that overall sort of symbiotic framework for surveillance.
Let
right?
DIA come out first. Now let's see what they're using in there.
Fair enough. Neeti, you wanted to talk a little bit about the fragmentation impact of licensing of these services, right? So on the internet, what is this impact and what's wrong with licensing? What impact does it have on fragmentation? Mic's off. That mic is not working, by the way. No,
It is,
it's working?
yeah.
Okay.
So if you are to introduce a licensing framework for applications, right, my best guess is that bigger applications who have the resources and the human resources to be able to navigate that framework with the changes and any sort of like maintenance that it would need. Licensing frameworks, as we've seen in the last couple of years also, as they've been suggested, can be subjected to a lot of change, right? A lot of compliance. So my best guess is that bigger apps with more resources are going to be able to navigate that. What about smaller applications, startups, new ventures, especially if they're homegrown, right? What does this licensing framework mean for them if they're not able to navigate it, if they're not able to keep up?
We're seeing that happen in pretty much every domain, right? So for example, 2011, IRDAI came out with a licensing framework for online insurance aggregators that killed 90% of that industry. The RBI recently came out with a whitelisting for lending apps and a registration mechanism. They came out with a licensing framework for payment gateways, which meant that every payment gateway, which was basically an intermediary, had to now buy licenses. So there's licensing coming into every domain. Why not in communications? What is so special about communications that payment gateways need to be licensed but not communications, lending licensed but not communications, insurance marketing companies need to be licensed but not communications?
So all the categories you're talking about essentially deal with money.
Fair.
Can you regulate money, transactions, payments the same way as speech? Like if I want to have a personal private conversation with a friend and there is sensitive information in there where I'm voicing my opinions, no bounds at all, do I not have the privilege to do that? But if I'm defrauding someone, and if I'm like harming that person on a monetary level, I should surely be held accountable for that. But be held accountable for my opinions in a way that this government is meditating it to be, it's not the same thing to me. Like, we can't compare apples and oranges.
Jalak, is there a 19.2 argument for licensing, against licensing? 19.1 argument.
Yeah, I think you can make one. I think you can make an argument that is it a reasonable restriction on speech?
Or an unreasonable restriction on speech?
Or an unreasonable restriction? And what is like the objective you're trying to satisfy with that restriction? And over here, I guess the question will be, what is the purpose of the licensing? Which, as we've been hearing in this room for the last 1 hour, seem to be many different reasons and no one can quite come to the crux of it. But the challenge will be is if the government uses the national security ground, we've seen courts being hesitant to engage with that and set stuff aside. Though, of course, I think there was a Media One judgment sometime back where Chandrachud did try to question the usage of the terminology in national security and saying that the government needs to justify it. So, I mean, there are instances where it has been done, but we sort of are in this vicious cycle right now where we come back to national security.
Okay. I'm blocking the camera. Anonymous person, any views on this? No views. Okay. Fair enough. I'm not going to pick on people. It's okay. I'm beyond that now. Aman, any add-on to that?
On the 19.2 restriction question, or
licensing?
Fragmentation. So I think.
So if you had to challenge a licensing framework for OTT communications services,
sure,
what would your grounds be?
I mean, several, but fundamentally, I mean, I'll again go back to what I started with, right? What is the purpose with which you're seeking to introduce licensing? Till we have clarity on that, and I mean, every challenge will be on whether the measure that you're seeking...
National security grounds.
Is it proportionate, right? Then that becomes the question. Is there a better way? Is it the only way to achieve your objectives or not? Are there other ways? I think Amrita spoke about, other means of investigation also being available. It's not only about data. There is also consequent harm that comes, right? Your ability to speak freely. There is a speech restriction clearly that's coming in through this sort of national security licensing framework, which requires you to share all that information. So yes, there is definitely that scope for a challenge.
Any comments, questions? Anyone?
So I would say it would also depend on, once we see what could be the possible conditions of the license, right? Like if you're saying that national security ke ground pe is your rationale for licensing, but if you're also imposing the sort of conditions that we have on TSPs, that the license is maybe for a 10-year or 20-year period, or entry and exit is not that difficult, that does not fit the rationale of national security. That is only reducing the options which are there for the consumers. That's making it difficult for someone to enter the market. So it would really depend on what conditions, if any, they impose in the name of national security. I think.
Understood. So two aspects, right? What benefits are you getting for a license, and what harms are you preventing for a license?
Yeah, and if they make sense, like if you're saying national security, if you're doing this, and there is a linkage between both, then that could be a valid argument. But if you're imposing everything which is imposed on TSPs in the name of national security, I am confident that that might not hold.
Okay. Any comments, questions? Aditi. We will close with this, and there's going to be tea post that.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out what happened with the laptop imports last week. The notification came into immediate effect because of national security and cyber security reasons. And despite repeated questions, the ministry could not actually focus on or highlight any particular incident that had disrupted the hardware chain, the hardware supply chain for laptops being imported to India. So national security then becomes a catch-all phrase. And there they had a very peculiar provision.
Launch of GeoBook.
Well, we shouldn't call a spade a spade. We shouldn't call a spade a spade. Let's call a spade a club or whatever. But there was an interesting provision there which said that if you want to import a laptop or any of those devices, you have to go to a portal and get a license. That notification, if I'm not wrong, came out on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and until Saturday that portal wasn't available, though the notification came into effect immediately. Imports got stuck.
Talk to the drones guys.
Yeah,
Like
also
their portal for registration as a drone operating company, they never worked for 6 months after the requirement came up.
And for licensing, what the ministry said was that, oh, this is Digital India, this is all online, this is a portal, you will get a license in 5 minutes. And we kept on asking the ministry, because there was this off-the-record conference that keeps happening, where they kept on saying that, we kept on asking them that in 5 minutes, what kind of tests are you running on hardware to assess whether or not it's safe? What is it that you're able to accomplish when all of it is online? No answers to that. Oh, it's a 10-year journey we have to take. This is just the first step. But have they achieved the first aim? No. So national security then becomes a catch-all to do whatever they want. I mean, that's calling a spade a spade.
So
Under
similarly, even a couple of days ago when they banned Chinese parts from being installed into drones, right? What is the justification that there'll be geo data recorded onto Chinese? Like, you're anyway doing that. There are so many satellites up in the axis of the earth, right? Like, what are we protecting?
I think there was a Reuters article to that. So
Oh, you just gave me a new phrase.
Geopolitics.
Technology policy has exactly geopolitics.
So
very cool. I'm going to use this.
I think the Reuters article pointed out they had spoken to drone manufacturers and they said, fine, we'll get it from somewhere else, but they are also eventually getting it from China. So the entire point, it's just a fig leaf for electoral purposes. We are heading into elections. China is our stated adversary. Look, we have a 56-inch chest. That's all.
So is this paranoia feeding paranoia, right?
Yeah. You otherize people and then foment chaos.
This is a conversation over tea. Thank you for a great discussion. I know we're all a bit tired. It's been 3 continuous sessions. Thank you all for being here. I hope this was useful and you learned something new or got some new points to consider. There's tea and coffee at the back. I'd like to thank Meta and Google for supporting this discussion, and Internet Freedom Foundation, Center for Internet and Society, Center for Communications Governance, Delhi, and CCAOI for supporting this discussion. Thanks everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks guys. Last discussion was सब थक गए थे ना सब थक गए थे last. I didn't need a lot of fireside, yeah.